All right, so good evening, everyone. It's 6 o'clock. We're going to call to order the April 20th, 2021 Placerville Planning Commission meeting. If everyone could please rise and join me for the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America, and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
With liberty and justice for all.
Fantastic. Okay, Mr. Painter, could you please call roll?
Member Friend.
Here.
Vice Chair Godberg.
Here.
Member Keeney.
Here.
Chair Lepper.
Here.
Member List. Here.
Okay, great, thank you. So our next item is the consent calendar. Do any members have commissioners have any questions or changes to the agenda or the minutes from last meeting and the agenda for tonight? Okay, seeing no changes, I'll entertain a motion to approve.
So moved.
To approve.
Okay, motion by Commissioner List. Commissioner Keeney, second. Perfect. So all in favor by voice?
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? Okay, fantastic. So we will move forward to items of interest to the public.
Point of order, Madam Chair, just very quickly to staff. It was raised in public comment some time ago, I think, that the Brown Act rules with video conferencing require roll call vote for everything. Did anyone ever take a look at that and see if that's true? I'm not asking for it, I just for follow-up and consistency.
I did not, Commissioner Friend.
Okay, thank you, sir. Sorry, Madam Chair, thank you.
No problem. Thanks for the clarification. Okay, so then we will move on to items of interest to the public, or I guess communications. Communications. Mr. Painter, do we have any communications tonight?
No, not tonight.
Okay, good. So now we'll do items of interest to the public. This is the portion of the meeting reserved for persons wishing to address the commission on matters not on tonight's agenda, but within the subject matter jurisdiction of the Planning Commission. Chair will recognize the speaker and comments will be limited to 3 minutes. Do we have any public attendees who would like to address the commission?
We do, Madam Chair. We have Ruth Michelson wishes to speak.
Okay, great. Ruth, you can go ahead and unmute yourself.
Yeah, good evening. Thank you. This is just a brief comment that I wanted to inform you that the decision that was made in the last meeting regarding the highway district and allowing the short-term rentals has been appealed. That's all I have to say.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ruth. Appreciate it. Any other members of the public wishing to address the commission?
No one else has raised their hand, Chair Lepper.
Okay, it looks like we
Oh, wait a
just
minute.
got one.
Just got one. Jennifer Chapman wishes to speak.
Okay, great. Jennifer, you can unmute yourself and go ahead.
She is unmuted.
Yeah, it looks unmuted. Okay, so looks like we might be having a little bit of an audio issue there. Are you able to unmute yourself, Jennifer, or speak? Okay, so I think that might be her there on the 415 number.
We have another speaker, so we could circle back to
Yeah, let's go to the 415 speaker. Speaker number 846, I'm sorry.
46.
Speaker 846.
Hi there, this is Jennifer. I'm so sorry. I have not figured out what it is with my microphone, but I guess I wanted to thank Pierre for, participating in this, event that I had organized on April 9th, and we are going to reschedule this speaker he actually even spent 10 years in Placerville, but he is in Michigan. He was the advisory commission executive director for this Keweenaw National Historical Park, which is copper mining in Michigan. It's a historical park that actually has 21 privately owned heritage sites associated with it, 2 state parks. It's just an interesting model that has a lot of connections to the kinds of historic resources we have here. And I wanted to thank Pierre for sitting in. He also heard about the Santa Monica Mountains, which is also just, another example of a place that has a national park boundary with very little national park land. It's like 150,000 acres with only 25,000 acres that's even federal. But I just wanted to say that I will be trying to reschedule this, and I'll try to certainly get the word to all of you, and hopefully Pierre at least will be able to participate. But I just appreciated that, and I appreciate that you have this other educational piece on tonight. I just hope that I know it looks like the city is now going to have the annex building, and obviously you'll have a role in some of what goes on with, again, that Art Deco, WPA, New Deal era. I just want to kind of keep emphasizing we have some really special resources here, and hopefully we can have a historic district and a cultural district, have both, because they're both really interesting, exciting ideas. But thank you all, and sorry for my technical challenges.
I'm glad you got it figured out. No problem. Okay, good. Well, thank you very much, Jennifer. Any other speakers tonight?
We have speaker 857 wishing to speak.
Okay, 857, you may now go ahead and unmute yourself.
Good evening, Planning Commission.
Oh.
I just have a request that item 3, the video presentation on the Secretary of Interior standards and guidelines. Don't know if you were planning on, at the end, asking for any public input. I don't know if I want to speak to anything in the presentation. Something might come up. So just a request that you open it up for public, whether they want to talk or no. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, great. Any other speakers?
We have no other hands raised.
Okay, great. So we will go ahead and close the public comment portion of this meeting and move on to our next item on our agenda, which is in fact our educational workshop session, where we will watch a video presentation that was presented to the Planning Commission in 2011 on the use and interpretation of the Secretary of Interior's standards and guidelines for the treatment of historic properties. So, Mr. Painter, do you have any input on this before we watch it?
I do. I'm going to share the screen here briefly just to educate the public and the commission that the city does link the Secretary of Interior standards for rehabilitation. So I'm going to go through that really briefly to show you where it is on our website, and then I will try not to have any video problems by getting the video up and running. And I'll preface that by saying there is some audio glitches with the video. It was taped or recorded at Town Hall, and there's a couple of times in the broadcast here where the speaker, Mr. Brandt, steps away from the microphone and is not audible. I believe he was pointing at the monitor or the screen in which the video was being, or his slides were being shown. Also, at the very end, during Q&A, members of the public did speak. However, from 10 years ago, I cannot recall whether or not microphones were provided for them or a microphone for them to step up to. In any event, most of that questions from the public are not audible. However, I think you, commissioners and the public, will get an understanding from the context of the question based on Mr. Brandt's response. So let me first try to share the screen here and show you where on the website the Secretary of Interior standards are located. Okay, so all of you should have the City of Placerville website on the screen. So if you hover over the word government and then navigate down to development services and then planning division, this will open up to our Division, the Planning Division webpage. And on the blue bar on the left side of the screen, one of the choices is historic districts residential. By clicking that, you'll get to information about the city's residential historic districts. There's a link to the maps of the districts, survey information from those properties that have been surveyed from that survey activity back in the 80s. But what I'm getting to tonight is there's a link to the Secretary of Interior Standards rehabilitation. And that will bring you to this document, which again, from the Secretary of Interior. It's quite a lengthy document. That's why we have it uploaded. So those of you who are interested in this information can download it at your leisure. But that is the subject, or this is the subject of tonight's video from literally 10 years ago. So I'm not sure how, let's see, I'm gonna have to stop the share so I can share another screen. So
Okay.
okay, so on my end, I'm turning the volume up pretty loud. So you'll have to adjust at home, or you as commissioners at home as well, to the preference, to the sound preference that works well for you. So I'm trying to capture the right soft talking that the speaker often makes while he steps away from the microphone.
Okay,
So,
thank you.
here you go. Oh, one moment. I forgot to do something. Hold on.
Workshop. We are very lucky enough tonight to have a special guest, Mr. Timothy Brent.
Here, can we have the people that have spoken turned off? Some of them keep talking and they're not muted. 846 has come on and
Okay, I'm going to share the sound. Now this should work. Famous last words. There we go.
Next, we'll move on to 7A, presentations and educational workshop. We are very lucky enough tonight to have a special guest, Mr. Timothy Brent, who is an AIA lead AP of the California Office of Historic Preservation, and he's going to give us a presentation regarding the use and interpretation of the Secretary of Interior Standards for Rehabilitation. Does staff have any thing that they'd like to add to this?
We can give you guys a little bit more background on Mr. Brandt. He is a member of the American Institute of Architects. He's an accredited professional in leadership and energy and environmental design from the U.S. Green Building Council. He is a senior restoration architect for the California State Office of Historic Preservation in Sacramento, as a supervisor of the Architectural Review Unit, and his responsibilities include statewide review of the federal tax certification projects and providing architectural review and technical assistance to federal and state mandated programs, government agencies, and the general public. He currently serves on the City of Sacramento Preservation Commission and has served in various capacities with the American Institute of Architects Los Angeles Board of Directors. He chaired the AIA's LA Historic Resources Committee. And we're very happy to have him here this evening. His talk will be, about 25 minutes or so, with about 15 minutes of question and answer. The public is certainly invited to participate as well.
We're going to turn that back on. And I set up the, it can be as interactive as we want, and I set up this talk for different commissions are required to have training every year, whether it's standards or certified local government training. And this can be anywhere from 20 minutes to 3 hours long. So I'll get through the first session, which is just introductory to the standards, the treatments and the standards. And then I'll go, if we have time and you're still awake, we'll go through some context, like walking down the street, how do they apply to typical buildings you may see in your neighborhood or in the main street. And the last part, if we're really energetic, is some case studies that you'll probably say yay or boo on some of the buildings. So I'm going to try to get the basics down first so we can have some fun and get through. I talk a lot to the slides, and I try to show the images because I think those are the most important, what people get, and try not to be too boring with the actual talking. But the standards are the basis for anyone working in preservation. It's the basis for what you should do in reviewing historic buildings. They give you the general principle on how you govern the work. It won't give you how to make a decision, but it gives you the groundwork for making those decisions. Good. This is a building in Sacramento. So one form or another, the standards are used by virtually everyone who works in preservation. And again, they give you they're the basis for work, but they're not design guidelines because that's what you have to implement at the local level. But your guidelines and standards should always be consistent with the standards. So this was a building that we got on the commission, and oops, sorry. I thought that'd work. No. There should be one more. Another picture of it doesn't want to do next. There we go. And it was a notice to abate. And unfortunately, you may have the same problem in Sacramento because the people are being let go. We no longer have enforcement. So unless people are calling in to an abandoned building, it's not going to be cited, it's not going to be posted. And then what we're also looking at for abandoned buildings where people just sit on the property waiting for it, either the economy to come around or get a better offer, so they let the building deteriorate it, but we have no way of going after these people to make sure that the properties aren't a drain on the rest of the neighborhoods. Let's see if I can get this. I want to click right, but am I doing it wrong? It worked for the first one, so I'll just do next. It doesn't seem to. So what would you do if this came before you? Now, the standards aren't technical or prescriptive, but they're intended to promote responsible preservation practices to protect our historic resources. They can't be used to make essential decisions, what can be saved and what can't be. But once a treatment, I'll talk about the treatment, is selected, the standards provide a philosophical consistency to the work. Now, it's important to educate the decision makers and those in the field on the application of the standards to cover the review of projects. Because as we know, local design review board or commission could have a lot of broad likes and dislikes, but it's not about what we like, it's about whether it meets the standards. And that's sort of my mantra about the office. When everyone asks me, but I don't like that, I go, does it meet the standards? Okay, so how can the treatments and the standards help you? Okay, learning objectives. We have 4 treatments and we have 10 standards, and those are in your handouts. And then if we get to it, we'll get to how to apply and interpret and apply it. And what we determine is if the project meets the standard based on the whole project, not just one aspect of the work. So the treatments and standards apply to historic properties of all construction types, sizes, uses, architectural styles and periods, and materials. And they can encompass not only buildings and the districts that the buildings are in, but landscape features, the site, the environment, and attached, adjacent, or related new construction. You can always still add to buildings, and that work should still be consistent with the historic building. Might differ depending on your review. The standards can apply to both the exterior and interior. It depends on the review authority. So a lot of local review, you won't have authority over the interior of the building. As a tax credit project, I have the right to control or review the interior of the building. So they can't just wholesale demolish something if there's a historic feature as part of that interior. So it's really what the local review allows. There are 4 treatments. And there's a hierarchy in the treatments. And from top to bottom, you maintain rather than repair. you repair rather than replace, you preserve rather than restore, and you restore rather than you reconstruct. So the Park Service had these guidelines, and originally they had 7, and in 1992 they came down to 4. And if you think about it, preservation clock, and I like this because it sort of gives me a philosophy. Preservation, time is going to temporarily stop in a moment in time. Rehabilitation moves the time forward so we can encompass the past as well as the future. In restoration, we're going to go back in time to find a certain period. And reconstruction, we're starting time over because it's all brand new. So I'm going to skip first to the last one, reconstruction, which establishes limited opportunities to recreate non-surviving site. It's usually you're replacing the whole building. And you're starting to clock over the ghosts from the past are all in a new package, so you're starting history anew. And if we go to example, Sutter's Fort is an example, where it was originally constructed in 1839, but it had pretty much disappeared by 1852. Vandals and people took the building components to build their own buildings. So in the 50s, they started reconstructing it, but it wasn't as accurate as we would now. They didn't have enough historic documentation or photographs. They didn't do a lot of archaeological survey. So today it would be probably a much better project, but it's what we have inherited, so we don't want to demolish the whole thing and rebuild it, but it was much more inaccurate than it is today. Restoration is the third treatment, and that emphasizes retention materials from the most significant time in a property's history. So to do that, you may have to remove things from certain areas, and you put things in that were missing. So we're looking backwards in time to find a significance. And a good example, this is the Stanford Mansion in Sacramento, where on the left, the original stair was lost in the 1940s fire, and they rebuilt it to current code then, with a switchback, because you can imagine that's not even to code now for sure. So during the restoration, they restored it back to the Leland Stanford period of significance, which included this straight run with a slightly curve around. And then you might ask, this is a really scary stair, and no way would you want to be going up and down all day. Well, why it's so high? Does anyone have an idea? It's because if you know the history of the Stanford Mansion, when they built, it was built in phases, and at one point it was a 3-story building, and the roof went up to here. And when they added the 4th floor, they kept the roof, and they just built the floor on top of the roof, so they didn't take the roof off. So there's that much space where if you look in certain areas, you can see the roof in between the floors. So that's why it's so high. So they left it because it's part of the history of the building. Now, restoration could also be for landscape. So while a postcard may not be accurate because they do some artistic license with postcards a lot of times, historic photographs can be very important. So this is the Wattles Mansion in Hollywood. And one thing I'll get to later is maintenance is still important too. So they did this great restoration. They're on their way. They haven't quite restored everything, but the drainage doesn't work. So the day I was there, I was sloshing through water the entire time. So you have to still do all your work to make sure that your restoration project is successful. Now, preservation is the first treatment. And that focuses on keeping the property as is right now. With all the changes over time, there are no new additions and no demolition preservation. So for the preservation clock, time is asleep for record-keeping purposes. And that example might be a house museum. So this is Oscar Stansbury House in Chico, and it's been operated as a house museum since 1975. So the city had acquired it. They kept it exactly like when he left. When he died, the family was there, and they never changed anything. So you go back in time to during that period. As I mentioned, preservation can be simple maintenance, so everyone can understand that. You need to protect your investment. So if you don't paint your house, what's going to happen? It's going to start deteriorating and fall apart. That's a building in Locke on the left. On the right is a Stanford Mansion again, where they had undergone a $2 million roof restoration, and the building was sitting because there were no funds to restore it. When they started to, they got money to restore it, and the first thing was structure, and they put in some steel beams in, which shook the house. Well, what happened was the first day, one of the ceiling medallions fell from the ceiling, and the plaster started falling. So what they had found is while they did a $2 million roof restoration, no one cleaned the gutters in all the years it sat. So the water had run under the roof and down the walls and across the ceilings. So all the plaster had lost its key, so it just started falling off in sheets. So they had to stabilize, so they wouldn't lose a lot of plaster, the rest of the plaster. And then one of my favorite ones, this was a tax project in LA where an orange tree was growing out of the gutter on the roof. So obviously you don't want water running out, you want to fix your gutters, your downspouts, so you're not creating more work in the end. And what I'm going to focus on is rehabilitation, because that's what I do every day. And why rehabilitation? Because that gives you the most flexibility. So pretty much everything you're going to do, you want to say the treatment's rehabilitation. And while it may involve some restoration or preservation, this gives you the most flexibility as the overriding treatment. So it allows it to be useful again. We're allowed to update the building. A lot of buildings may not have mechanical services. They may need structural work. So it allows you to do things, but you still protect what's the historic character defining features in the building. So I'm going to focus on, I mentioned 10 standards. So we had 4 treatments. So I'm going to talk now about the 10 standards under the rehabilitation treatment. And the first one is find a good use for the building. So make every effort for its original use. If you can't do that, what's going to create the least harm to the building? We have on the left is McClellan Air Force Base, where the officer housing was converted into a hotel. So there's an upstairs, downstairs unit. On the right is Zocalo's restaurant in Sacramento. It started out as an auto showroom, and it became a carpet showroom, and now it's a restaurant. Standard 2 is retain and preserving the historic character. So you need to look at the building, determine the character-defining features. You want to retain and preserve them, and you don't want to destroy them during the work. This is the lock again, and on the left you have one of the more historic buildings. Well, what happens over time, you start losing your historic character and potentially the district of the building. Different siding, different windows, different treatment. It all is a loss of historic fabric. And when you get what you want to get back to is on the upper left. Standard 3 is acknowledging the historic period. Recognize a building as a physical record of its time, place, and use. So when you retain the historical documentation, the historic development, you don't want to create a false sense of history by adding conjectural elements from other eras or other buildings. In other words, don't make changes that create a false sense of history. So on the left, I may ask you, is the building on the left or right the correct form for that row house? And as this would be the interaction part that we would go through, and hopefully you mentioned the left was I can never say it, colonializing the right, which is the Victorian. So that was the same on both sides, and they modernized it, put aluminum siding on it, the shutters, started changing out the windows. And even something, this house in Sacramento, basic as removing one of the wood posts and putting steel or the metal framing, starts to lose the character of the house. So you start breaking down the history, and it's not as important as it once was. This is a building in San Diego, Elks, Eagles Hall. This was the building was built in 1917. Then in 1934, they enlarged the building. So an important feature was removed during this remodel. So it was the pediment off on the right side of the building. They came in for a tax project, and this was the final product. So they chose to put back the pediment. But the Park Service said that you cannot put the pediment back because it never existed that way in its history. It existed, the previous slide, longer in its history than it did this. It's creating a false sense of history that the building existed like that over its lifetime. Another example is to retain and preserve historic changes. This was a log cabin home. It was built in the 1840s, and as most buildings evolve over time, well, they built a log cabin. It was a vernacular, and when they had money, they upgraded the building, so they put siding on it. So it had been sided, as part of the tax project, they removed the siding, They went back to the 1840s. However, the Park Service said because the building had survived for 120 years with the siding, that was more important because that's what history delivered than was the log cabin. Now, you could argue if you were doing a restoration, you might go back to the log cabin, but for rehabilitation, it would be more appropriate to keep the siding on the house. And a component of the building could be significant too. It had acquired change over time. So the Far East Cafe in Little Tokyo, National Historic Landmark in LA, was very important to the Asian community when they were sent to the internment camps. A lot of people stored their things here in the basement. And Anson Hardware down here on the lower right was important to the community as far as that's where you got all your gossip, your news, as well as buying your nails and screws and everything. And so as part of the rehab, they did restore that and kept it exactly as it was from the 1935 period. The rest of the building was 1898. In Standard 5, we want to preserve distinctive features, finishes, construction techniques, and materials. It could be as simple as a typical office floor, the ceiling on the left. It could be something as ornate as in the Hearst Castle, one of the ceilings. The important thing on the left is it doesn't have to look historic. What's historic about that picture is the ceiling plane, so that the ceiling, it always had a ceiling. It wasn't exposed to the structure above, the concrete structure. And a lot of buildings in Los Angeles are being converted from office buildings to apartments or loft housing. Well, the typical loft mentality is you have all exposed concrete and raw materials. And the owners were determined to remove the ceiling. So I walked through and they said, look at this ceiling, there's no way it can be salvaged. I said, well, you can take it, we can be flexible, you can take it out, but you're gonna have to put it back. You're gonna have to put a ceiling, a flat ceiling. You can't expose the concrete above. And they said, oh my gosh, well, we have all this, you know what this is on the ceiling? It's mastic, which had the ceiling tile glued to it. Well, mastic has asbestos in it, typically. So they said, it's going to cost us a fortune to remove this. We just have to get rid of it. I said, well, either way, you're going to have to take it to a landfill and dispose of it. You're going to have to, the mastic, or you can repair it and fix it, encapsulate it in place. Well, I don't know how they did it. Next time I went, all the glue dots were gone. I didn't ask. I don't want to know. But it was cheaper to keep that ceiling and patch the holes than it was to take it all down and put it back again. So it was their choice. Now, again, landscape features could be distinctive. So you could have a neighborhood development, you could have industrial, that's Mare Island, or you could have a garden apartment type. So you need to respect that too. So it's not just the building, it can be the setting and the property as well. Standard 6 involves repair rather than replace deteriorated features. So you need to survey your materials, look at the whole building, what is the existing condition, what is the degree of material integrity, and how severe is that deterioration? So on the left is a building in Sacramento that I go by all the time, and it's slowly falling in on itself. But it's all repairable. I mean, you might have some siding you have to replace, some dry rot, but you don't have to wholesale put a whole new siding on that house. It's already received, like there's a window, they did a sliding window up there, but it's not beyond repair yet. And ideally, when you do something, you do like a Dutchman, where it's going to fit into the piece, and it's logically, it's going to age, and it's going to weather, so it'll look just like the rest of the wood eventually, and that fence replacement. And again, some buildings weren't built to standard. They were built incorrectly, or they didn't have the details, or it was just built cheaply. On the right is a typical building in the Delta, where either the buildings were built right on the dirt, or they had a brick foundation with no support, no structure or reinforcement in it, or minimal reinforcement. So a lot of times what you have to go in is you may have to raise the building, and you can protect it. You can meet current code 6 inches above the ground and do a new sill plate to protect the rest of the building. At the Wawona Hotel, what they did was the building was sitting literally on stone piles. There were just piles of stones underneath it. And at the corners was just wood. So what they did as a seismic retrofit was they took off the perimeter skirting around the porch. And they actually board formed concrete to look like the siding. So it was broken up. So when it was painted, I have to go back and take a picture now that's been done for years, but they painted it so you can't tell unless you go up and knock on it that's actually concrete. It just looks like the rest of the wood skirting around the building. Now in cleaning, you want to clean using the gentlest means possible. And it used to be a lot of people use sandblasting. So on the far left, this part was obviously sandblasted. There was a sign here. That's why that wasn't affected on that building. On the upper right was the Bradbury Building in Los Angeles, and what they had done when I came onto the job was, you see on the left, it was actually burnt the wood. They were using the same cleaner they used on the stone on the wood, and it was too harsh for the wood. So we worked down to, finally, it went from this, over 100 years of cigars and cigarette smoke and everything, to this is what it cleaned up to be. So we went through several iterations of how to clean the material. This was a building in Hollywood I worked on, the Hollywood Taft building. I almost lost my job on this one. This was the condition of the building, dark. We thought it was brown brick. And on one weekend, I talked to a cleaner, and they said, oh, well, we can really clean it up for you. I said, well, let me talk to the owners. We'll see what we can do. They went on the weekend at asking. And the owners came Monday morning and said, what did I do? I said, I didn't even know what went on, so I had to go down. And they never cleaned the building. But at least they know it was actually yellow brick, is what they could do to the building. So that was a dramatic, I wish they had the money that they would have been able to clean the building. Now, there are standards in I can never say that, archaeology, and there are laws on that. So what the standards do is recognize those laws, and that if you work on a property and you dig it up, that there's certain things you have to follow that you may find. This is the back of Stanford Mansion again. We used to be in the resources building, in that tall building in the background, but they discovered a couple cisterns and cesspools and everything, so they actually excavated a lot of that and got some artifacts out of that. Now, standard 9 and 10 could be considered together. They're for new additions, new work. Number 9 is additions, exterior alterations, or related to construction shall not destroy historic materials that characterize a property. Number 10 is essential form integrity of a historic property and its environment must be unimpaired if the new work is removed in the future. Ideally, some things you add could be removed and you still have the historic building. It could stand by its own, and you can't tell that you had removed the work. This was the 3-story building in Portland, Oregon, and what they decided to do was add a 4th floor. And it's problematic adding to smaller buildings because you really want to set back the new work so that you can still see the historic building. So this could be a question: do you feel this is appropriate? Where does the historic building stop and where does the new building start? Well, their answer was, we just put the date on, and Park Service didn't agree with that. They said it was too close to the original and it did not get the tax credits. Now, one that did is the Hall of Justice in Sacramento, where ideally, if you do a new addition, it should be in the back of the building. You can't always do that. This is on the corners, but the addition was put on the back, and there's ideally a hyphen, or there's a clean break or a separation between the buildings. And that allows the historic building to cleanly be read. And even though it's use of modern materials, completely modern, they match the sight line, the horizontality, so the openings to a certain degree. So even it can be clearly read as a contemporary add-on or addition to the historic building. So this is sort of the first part. So we have how many treatments? 4. Thank you, 4. And how many standards? Good, excellent, thank you, okay. So that gives you sort of a very fast, and this is, this could have been longer, but if you're okay, I'll go through about the same time for interpretation application. So, okay, we'll look at that. So things to look about, so we get something at the Preservation Commission. If staff did their job correctly, we'll know, this will either be in the staff report or we may know the building. So things that don't necessarily affect your decision, but as maybe a planner or someone, expert working in the field, it's good to know, you should know about the significance and type, the context, what it looks like around the building, the massing size scale. We'll go through a little bit of infill and the codes and regulations. And that is all balanced with then the decision of how does that meet the standards or how does that meet the historic character of the building. So under significance, it doesn't have to be the Carson Mansion to be significant. Now it's on the National Register. It could be a rental property in Chico. So this is on the National Register as a contributor to a historic district, and that was eligible. It went through tax credit process. Now what, unfortunately, we can't do as a tax credit process is if existing conditions remain, you don't necessarily have to alter them, but if you do, they have to be compatible with the standards. The problem was the parking. And that was supposed to be a lawn, but it's student housing. So right after it was a nice lawn, it was approved. I went back a couple years later, and they're already parking on the lawn. But it's a 5-year rule on the tax credits. After 5 years, you can pretty much do what you want. But within that 5 years, we have the right to yank those tax credits if you do something that's bad to the building. So you want to look at what's the place of the building in history, and did any events happen there, and what is historic, and you want to keep that. Now, the building type becomes very problematic sometimes. How do you reuse? This was a bean and grain silo in Irvine, and they turned it into a La Quinta. And how do you put openings in silos, or people are going to live in them or reside in them overnight, and you need to, so the compromise was you put windows on one side, and this happened to be a triangle on the outside. The windows went on one side, but when you look at the other side, you don't see the windows. So certain vantage points, you still have the historic view of the building, and but you're allowed to update it, because otherwise you just can't reuse some of these buildings. The massing size and scale is very important. You need to balance new development with maintaining your existing quality of life and the sense of place, your historic neighborhoods. So is your community looking at smart growth, mixed use density? Is that actually promoting higher density, larger buildings? So even though at odds a lot of time is a preservation guidelines or standards and the planning and zoning. They don't always mix, because you can build this building on the left anywhere in Sacramento, but does it really belong on the street, on the right? If you have a design guidelines or a preservation overlay zone or some sort of guidelines that supersede the planning, you could prevent maybe something like that, a mansion or a property-to-property line building. In East Sacramento, we have something called the tent ordinance. And what that is, you go up 12 feet from the property line, and then you go back at a 45-degree angle, and your house has to fit within that parameter. So you can still go up to a 35 feet plate line for the roof, the top of the roof, but you have to fit, it fits more into the rest of the building, the rest of the neighborhoods. You can still do contemporary, but again, the mass, the size, and scale are similar.
Sorry.
It's okay.
I think I may have inadvertently stopped the video here. Let me fast forward.
The tax credits, after 5 years, you can pretty much do what you want, but within that 5 years, we have the right to yank those tax credits if you do something that's bad to the building. So you want to look at what's the place of the building in history, and did any events happen there, and what is historic, and you want to keep that. Now, the building type becomes very problematic sometimes. How do you reuse? This was a bean and grain silo in Irvine, and they turned it into a La Quinta. And how do you put openings in silos, or people are going to live in them or reside in them overnight, and you need to, so the compromise was you put windows on one side, and this happened to be a triangle on the outside. The windows went on one side, but when you look at the other side, you don't see the windows. So certain vantage points, you still have the historic view of the building, and but you're allowed to update it, because otherwise you just can't reuse some of these buildings. The massing size and scale is very important. You need to balance new development with maintaining your existing quality of life and the sense of place, your historic neighborhoods. So is your community looking at smart growth, mixed use density? Is that actually promoting higher density, larger buildings? So even though at odds a lot of time is a preservation guidelines or standards and the planning and zoning. They don't always mix, because you can build this building on the left anywhere in Sacramento, but does it really belong on the street, on the right? If you have a design guidelines or a preservation overlay zone or some sort of guidelines that supersede the planning, you could prevent maybe something like that, a mansion or a property-to-property line building. In East Sacramento, we have something called the tent ordinance. And what that is, you go up 12 feet from the property line, and then you go back at a 45-degree angle, and your house has to fit within that parameter. So you can still go up to a 35 feet plate line for the roof, the top of the roof, but you have to fit, it fits more into the rest of the building, the rest of the neighborhoods. You can still do contemporary, but again, the mass, the size, and scale are similar to the rest of the buildings in the neighborhood. Now, it all depends on your local ordinance. So what is your existing historic context for a main street? So you want to identify the traditional development patterns and evolution of them over time. Do you have more of a rural, that's Bridgeport on the left, type of main street, or do you something like San Jose, where it actually developed over time, And you have a variety of buildings. This building being actually one of the more historic buildings on the street. So you did have high rises at critical corners in downtown cities, and you had usually at corners anchors, and then the block filled in later on. And usually that changed over time. So we had the 30s, you had Art Deco, Art Moderne, we had the 50s, and then we had the great 70s. So if you remember, we still have the, what was it, Western, the Western wear. So we still get some of those when they covered everything with wood siding, the rough wood siding. The jeans people, I'll think of it. Levi, there was another Wrangler or there was a depot, like Jean Depot or something. I was going to write that down because I wanted to remember, because we just got one of those, and he said, "Is this? It's country western. It's historic," and we said, "No, that's country western 70s. It's not country western like the West." They were dead set. They were just sure that. And then if you don't have a preservation ordinance, what can happen? A building should really fit good within its surroundings. So we have Toronto is having a lot of high-rise development. So this is right in the middle of a historic row house development. You have this nice glass tower going up next to you. And then this is development in Sacramento off Alhambra. I don't know if they tore down the Alhambra Theater in Sacramento. It started the preservation movement in Sacramento. And as a result, new buildings in the Alhambra corridor have to be designed in a Spanish colonial revival style. So this was a medical building which had to comply with that design guideline. So not only that, but it also steps down to the neighborhood. So it came around the corner, and it was very respectful. And even though it's a commercial building on a residential block, and this is like the last block before the main street, so it's really on the border of the commercial and the residential, but it still fits into the neighborhood. Because you should define what can be built and what should be built in some neighborhoods. So just because you can build it doesn't mean you should be allowed to build it. But it's my property, I can do anything I want. But I know, but your neighbors may not agree with that. So it's up to the neighborhood to decide what they want in their neighborhoods. Government can't tell them. They have to protect themselves and tell us what they want for their neighborhoods. So some design reviews, some essential documents when you look at design guidelines. A survey. So you need to know what your historic resources are. You need to document them. So you have something defendable. You have a survey. You need a preservation plan. You need to have to define your goals. So at the end of the day, you can say, yes, I've met those goals. You need a preservation ordinance, which is a legal mandate that everyone has to follow. So if they go, they have to follow the code, and they have to do the permits. They also have to follow the guidelines under the preservation ordinance. And then you also have design guidelines. And those can be as strict or as stringent or as flexible as the local jurisdiction wants. So we also have to look at architecture and defining the architectural styles and features. So look at the neighborhood. Is there a specific style, prevalent architectural style? A lot of them won't. They'll have everything from Queen Anne to Victorian to Craftsman. Is it intact from the period of significance, or has it changed, been so altered? In Sacramento, we have a lot of blocks where they did the dingbat houses or the shoebox apartment buildings, that don't have no eyes and ears in the street. They're side entry, and so it's a flat facade on the street, so no one's watching out for the neighborhood. So new construction should support the neighborhood and enhance it, not detract from it. So on the upper left, it's a building in Napa, which is modern. So we have buildings of the recent past, so buildings that are 50 years old, which is one of the minimum criteria for National Register. It would be eligible. Would it be eligible for National Register? Yes, it's 50 years old. It doesn't necessarily mean it should be listed. On the right is a brand new building, so you have to decide, can you do a mock historic building? Is that appropriate? Is that what you want for your neighborhood? This is all new development, so yes, it would be appropriate. But is it creating a false sense of history? So you're creating a Victorian, but it's 2010. And in the bottom left, this is the Von Trapp family visit Sacramento, in that they really redid this whole Swiss chalet thing on this house, which used to be just like next door. So it's really, yes, it's my property. I can do what I want with it. Then other considerations are code-driven. So what may affect the character, integrity, and what is compatible. So how do you incorporate new systems without adversely impacting the property's character and integrity? So it could be plumbing, electrical, hazardous material abatement. If poorly integrated, these code measures could really destroy the historic character of the building. The upper right is lead abatement, so you don't necessarily always have to abate it. You don't have to strip it back to the bare wood and ruin the wood. You can sometimes encapsulate it. So as long as you don't have a problem with that, there's some HUD rules, and you don't have children gnawing on your windowsills and everything. You can encapsulate it, and HUD accepts that now. What we're getting into is lead sustainability, people putting solar panels or skylights on their building. How's that impact the building from the public right of view? And on the right, Stanford again, where they decided the rear wing of the house, they need to put a catering kitchen in. So they wouldn't ruin the original wood and fabric of the house. They built a room within a room. So they built a whole new, because all the plumbing.
Oh, yeah, I saw that. Well, you were able to correct it right away. So that was, at first I thought it was me, and I'm looking, God, what did I hit?
I think
Sure, the floor and everything. They put that in and then put a new structure on top of that. So in theory, everything could be taken out and you still have the original building under that. But everything, it's a brand new catering kitchen. So from inside, it's a brand new room. You wouldn't even be able to tell. I mentioned we have LEED sustainability, and you probably hear this all the time, but the mantra, historic buildings are inherently green, so why tear them down, send them to the landfill? There were historic features like louvers in the Delta or awnings. I don't think we'll ever think that swamp coolers are historic, but it was, they had some louvering down below. But look at historic ways that buildings, they had mass, they had bulk, all these things that protected the building, and you don't need brand new windows necessarily. You don't need brand new doors to do that. Now, the thing we're always facing is accessibility. So civil rights law, every public building has to be accessible as possible. So we try to integrate that and balance it with historic integrity. So ideally, if you're doing new construction, new sidewalks, you're going to blend that in. We have Old Sacramento where they have the raised sidewalks. So what they did was at the end of the sidewalks, they have the ramps coming down. Parks Property Empire Mines, they did on the wood, again, decking. They did a ramp going up. And a church in San Diego where they just did a temporary measure because they didn't want to ruin the stairs and they didn't have enough length for it, so it's a temporary ramp. But ideally, if you work with Public Works or as things are working out, San Jose, they sloped the sidewalk so it goes up to the doors. They worked far enough away that they were able to do a sloping sidewalk so you don't need railings. And at the Presidio, one of the areas that they did was they had to take up tile anyway, so they were able to match it, so they started ramping backing up so you didn't have to necessarily a noticeable ramp. It worked into the paving for the pattern. So remember, this was the front view of that building, the fire damaged building. This is actually a tax project in Los Angeles. And the owners were going to tear it down. It was bought, and the people did restore it. So what I'm hoping tonight's conversation is that we'll give you some guidelines and some recommendations to get from this to that as part of your work. And I wish I'll have to go down and take pictures because the client submitted these, the owner submitted these because I really need some nice pictures. But that is the end of the second part. I don't know if you want the third, the case studies. I won't talk to those, I could just show you. Is that okay? Yes. Thank you, okay. This is sort of the fun part, even more fun. It's like, not having fun yet. So this is an addition connector. This is the Bridgeport Courthouse. And from the front, you can't see the addition. If you walk around the back, they did a glass box, which has the elevator and connects the lower building and the courthouse building in the front. And this is sort of the part, the interactive workshop, but I'm just going to go through these so that we won't take the time now, but just to give you some ideas of applications. So you could argue, does that match the historic part of the building? It's clearly contemporary. It could be reversible. It could be taken away, and you still have both historic buildings. This is Oakland Fox Theater, and from the front, you can't tell. I mean, it was a rehab. This is a performing arts school, but they needed to expand and add an addition. And the issue became, disagreement became over the 2 stories that they added on the side of the building, which were 1-story wings. The Park Service determined that they needed to have punched openings to match the front of the building. I want to show you, this is all construction shots. This is what they originally came in. And they thought it's contemporary, it's cleanly new. This was the historic part, punched openings. They came in with a glass box that fit on top. It's clearly differentiated. And actually our office supported this. We thought looked great because it was a clean element. It was placed in the building. The Park Service, when it went back, said no. So we had a major disagreement on that, which doesn't happen very often. But that was we went through several reiterations on. They said 10 feet. The Park Service said 5 feet. We compromised on 7 feet back. So they had to set the second floor back from the parapet here, and then the size of this varied slightly too. So we went back and forth a couple feet, but it got approved. And that's actually the completed project.
What was the magic amount of 7 as opposed to 10?
Somebody's favorite number that day. It didn't really make sense. It was a critical, I think it was 7.5 because that became the depth, the width of the corridor, and still to do a performance room or something. So that's how we wound up at 7.5 because they said we can't go to 5 because then it's just not workable. It doesn't work. This is the Naked Coffee Cafe in Sacramento. They built new construction as part of it. It was also a fire-damaged property that they restored, and then they financed the restoration, the rehab, by doing new development. It's two-story. It's behind the side. It's a lot of tree coverage, so it's a very successful project. Necessarily modern wouldn't necessarily fit on every street, though. This was the Elks Club, and it's a chocolate factory. And what they did, downstairs is the store, upstairs is meeting rooms, and they built this manufacturing plant. So they kept the height and lowered it. They actually matched the building, the profile, the colors, everything. And I'm trying to remember where this is. I apologize. And Fellows Hall. It's Chocoholics and so they actually make it there, so you can go down this building and see the assembly line. But what I loved about it was it's chocolate-colored building too. So you're hungry before you actually even go inside. So that was a successful tax project. And I think I have. So just around the corners. It's very scaled, and they could have pretty much built anything out there. They had a lot of land. And an adaptive reuse project in Sacramento, this is where the governor lives now. We actually turned this down for a tax project well before he was governor. But a couple of things. One, they were going to replace all the windows because it was on a busy street. And we said, no, you have to either retrofit the existing glass for light and sound, but you can't replace all the windows. But the second thing was the addition on the top, very visible. The third thing was the interior restaurant operator wanted to demolish all of the auto showroom, had this very ornate terracotta wall. And those three things were just too much. Maybe one of them we could have worked out, but the three of them together, we just said, no, they can't do those. Well, it turned out when the restaurant, it was a chain restaurant that has a pro forma. When you walk in, you could be anywhere. It has to look like their style, though. They actually fell in love with the wall and kept it. So it was a potential tax project, but they were already finished by then. But right down the street, if you look, they're building it now. This was an infill right next to the building. So you could argue, and we could go back and forth, is this appropriate infill? It's on a corner, it's right next to the historic building. You look at the size, the scale, the height, again, all the things we talked about, and you decide in your mind, could you approve this as a infill project? This is the Biltmore, a fairly old hotel, a fairly old addition, but the Biltmore built a tower, which is office, and it's a garage down below, and it has the porte cochere where you drive in for the hotel. But the question is, do you feel that's appropriate style? They match the historic style of the building exactly, but it's a tower, which doesn't quite, the details don't quite apply to such a scale of a building. So I'd argue that that's not a very successful, even though they did a stylized tower. Then we go complete opposite to something new, and we hit Toronto again, where their museum, so this is called the Crystal, which is attached to the Royal Ontario Museum. This was financed by a $30 million grant from a Canadian philanthropist. And it just, I hope that shows from the light, but this feels like either a meteor crashed or part of the building fell down into the street and all these cars, it's like an accident. And The museum, I love, because where the modernist just engulfs and takes over the building. But museum leadership speaks of it, but making a bold statement for the modern era. So I guess that's how they approved it. And my last couple are infill. And these are both San Francisco. So what's appropriate infill or successive new design in older areas? So on the left, we have a completely contemporary, I'd say 70s version, based on the openings, the windows, and the quality of the windows. And on the right, this Victorian actually burned almost to the ground. And what the neighborhood group pitched in financially and helped the owner, because they wanted the street to remain exactly the same as it was. The whole street is this facade. So they actually were successful in creating the identical facade again. And my last example is an adaptive reuse and new construction. This is the Del Mar train station in Pasadena, which was originally, it was a tax project, it came in. Unfortunately, what happened, this is also a train station, so this is what happens sometimes with smart growth and transit development, where there's a pro forma, not pro forma, but the FA floor area ratio becomes so high that it dwarfs the existing building. So a couple things happened that was denied tax credits. One, they moved the building off-site, put a parking garage underneath it, and moved the historic depot back. But they didn't put it on grade, not the same place either. They raised it because the parking ramp was underneath. So that was the first bad thing. The second is the new development encroaches within 10 feet of the building. So that's the berm that they raised. It would have been originally on the sidewalk, and now you need steps to get into the building. And then I'm not sure if I can go back. But the whole, it becomes overpowering for the building. So you know, it's no longer have the setting any longer, the historic property setting of what the building was. I think that is my last slide. So there we go. Now the handouts, there is I'm not sure if it printed out 11 by 17, but there's a comparison. It's available on our website of comparing the treatments and the standards. They also did financial incentives, and we can talk about that later, or you can give me a call. And I also started putting together, our office started posting some design guidelines. And so what we've done, when we see successful examples or what that we want to go back to, we started making a list of those for you for that. So one thing I did, the main thing I wanted to leave you with, the incentive that is available is the ADA tax incentive for businesses. So small businesses, there's a credit, and that's on the financial incentive page on the second page. There's a disabled tax credit, and there's a deduction. And it varies a number of employees and the number of the gross revenues every year, but it allows for your average home or business person to upgrade properties and get the credit and deduction for it. So if they say they don't have money, because we want to avoid the ambulance lawyers coming down, and what they do is they pick a street or pick a town, and they go down and they sue everybody on the block. And all they want is the money. They don't care about whether anyone can actually get into the building. No one has to be handicapped or disabled to sue under the right. Anyone can do that, and there are people that do. So just look out, and there is some money there. It's not brick and mortars, but it does allow some financial. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Brent. Does any of the commissions have any questions?
Yeah, we're here at Placerville. We're in the process of sort of reconstituting and reestablishing our historic advisory committee, and one of their first tasks is going to be to basically conduct an inventory. And I was wondering, are there some guidelines or some adult supervision you can give us in terms of how to undertake that?
Definitely. We have a number of survey guidelines on our website, and it's under the local government unit, and Lucinda Woodward is the supervisor for that unit. And they can also come out. Marie Nelson in our office is very good at giving sort of the guidelines for how to do a survey. And as we receive a lot of surveys, we want to make sure they're to our criteria, that we can list them on our database, eventually, so we can take advantage of your survey. So I would contact, and we can talk, and I can either give you my card, or if you go online and you talk to Cindy Woodward, and then they can certainly.
Any other questions? Okay, does anyone from the public have any questions?
the biggest thing, sometimes they will be too deteriorated, so at a certain point, but what we have under the energy guidelines right now and the credits is window manufacturers, and the biggest thing, the underlying thing about LEED and sustainability, it's all about new product. So they're selling something. So we're not really, if you think about it, I'm a LEED AP, so I can talk the talk, but we also have to balance with historic buildings. So at some point, we need to look at the historic feature. So you look at your windows, and are they too deteriorated to repair? The sustainable people will say that, well, windows leak, and they're their biggest energy loser as far as the building. But it's actually not the glass in the windows, it's the surrounding, it's around your trim and where the air gets in. So if you look outside, if you have a stucco house, it cracks between the stucco and the window. That's where the air gets in, not through the glass. Or you're not weatherproofing, so it gets through the sills, the sashes, underneath the doorway. If you can see air through underneath your door, it's not. That's where you're losing the air, not through the door. So what we ask people, is to look at the historic building and can your windows be retrofitted? Sometimes you can, for large commercial applications, you can put a film or you can put a second layer of glass to sandwich it and still keep the exterior look. The windows are getting better as far as replacement. At a certain point, there was a project in San Francisco. It was a Timothy Pfluger high-rise, and it was built in the 30s, and the same family owned it, and they were very protective. And it turned out they had a towel service every year because the windows leaked, and they didn't want to replace the windows, but they found they were steel and they rusted from the inside out, and they kept painting them, but it wouldn't take any more paint because it would just fall through the holes. And so we actually approved wholesale window replacement, but they matched the windows exactly, the profile. So when you go to replace, if you reach that step, make sure you match it in size, shape, profile. And the standard 6 for replacement actually says the very last thing is where possible material. So we're not saying that you have to, like if you wood window, you actually have to replace it necessarily with wood, but that replacement, there are a lot of good clad ones now and the composite ones. But remember, when vinyl was the big thing, well, vinyl windows are wearing out now, and you can't repair them. So you have to rip. We had a tax project from '86. There were no windows in the building. It was a vacant hull. So they were able to do the windows. Well, at the '86, vinyl was the big thing, the replacement windows. So they put in. They're having to replace them this year, and this is because they all wore out and they couldn't be fixed. So they're putting fiberglass as now the next generation, and I'm hoping they'll last a little bit better. But I have a feeling fiberglass is a better conductor. It isn't as bad as vinyl, and it's paintable as far as fiberglass. So they are getting better. And actually, I just did a major remodel in my house, and I saved all my windows. I took over from the contractor because they were breaking the glass because they were doing the putty, but they were using a blow gun on the putty, and I was using the little hair dryer thing, going around. I said, so I did the windows, my historic windows myself, and I used Marvin windows, which were a little more, but I got the wood because I wanted the wood look. They're clad on the outside. I did do fiberglass for the bathroom because I designed it, the shower stall. I have a second floor overhang, and I designed the outside to look like a sleeping porch, but that's actually the shower. So when you're in the shower, you're like in a porch. But the windows are in the shower, so I did fiberglass because obviously you wouldn't want wood windows. So even sometimes we'll do fiberglass windows. But long story short, try to save the original and look at retrofitting, weatherproofing, weather stripping, all the insulation of the walls, all things you can do that you're going to find out are far more losing energy than they're actually windows.
Great. Any other questions? Okay, we want to thank you very much for coming and taking your time.
Very welcome.
It was very informative. We really...
Let's see. I won't comment on local reviews because I want to, but the product for tax projects, we don't approve that right now. Local review can approve because you can be flexible. So we have one set of standards, but they can be interpreted different ways. So I may have some HUD reviews that are state review, And I might provide more flexibility in some things because of either economy, budget, or other criteria. It's a south-facing wall or something, or gets the brunt of the wind and the weather or something. So under local review, certainly it might be approvable. Again, I go back to standard 6. So we have the standards now that we're basing our decisions on. And does it meet the criteria, shape, form, size, look, appearance, the last thing being materials? What we don't know, and I don't know if it's proven, is the hardy board and that type of material. Do we have a track record for it? What is the testing that's been done on it? How long will it hold up? Or are you creating something down the road that's going to be worse than what you had before? Because we know old growth wood we can't get anymore, but unless you demolish a building or get somewhere. But that's still the best thing. It lasts if you protect it. It should last hundreds of years.
So how are we supposed to reconcile the fact that we are in a state-mandated high fire hazard, that when you go and do a major project that you have to do fire-resistive construction in an area where you can't use it? Okay. So maybe you can help us out with that.
There is the State Historic Building Code, which I didn't talk about, which can allow for not wood for that. And that's the local jurisdiction call. We had a number of wood roofs, and one was in Glendale and one was in Los Angeles. The Los Angeles one was a train depot, wood shingles. It was in the middle of a parking lot. It was across from a new red line station, underground. And the city was arguing that in the event of a fire, huge pieces of the building will fly off and hit bystanders or hit adjacent buildings. Well, your adjacent building, you can barely, it's across the parking lot, across the street. And the fire department comes to State Historic Building Code, just with these are both appeals. And the firemen come and are pretty intimidating with their full regalia and outfits. I want to have an outfit too, just like that. But so they came and all this and stuff. And actually, the State Historic Building Code, which represented, I think it's 13 or 15 members, and I represent parks under that. There was a fire code representative. There's a contractor. The board cited that they could put wind shingles in that case because it presented no danger to adjacent buildings because of the separation and from the adjacent properties. Glendale was a house, and it was one of those storybook cottages. It had roll roofing around and little dormer windows, and it was in a cul-de-sac. Right, the slope of the property went right behind it. It was bordered on the forest, the Angeles Forest, I think, up there. So the fact, and the fire department came out again, the Glendale Fire Department, and said that it represented a risk not only to the building, but if the building caught from outside to the building, but if the building caught fire, it presented a hazard to the rest of the people in the block and the whole neighborhood. And the board agreed that in that case that we would not allow wood shingles for that. So it could be new codes, adjacencies, buildings are built closer together, so you would not want that hazard. So that is up to the local jurisdiction again to decide what is important. Sometimes you can go to, and it's easier said than done because I don't know all the circumstances, but exterior sprinklers, you can do water curtains sometimes, so I'm sure you've gone through all that. But those are the decisions that you make. So you have your code, you have your mandate, what you need to do. And it's like ADA a lot of times. It's a mandate, it's a civil rights law, but we have a historic building. Well, is there some way that we can reach a compromise in the middle of the road that protects, we have alternatives that protects what you need to do to protect life, fire life safety, but also protects the historic character of the building. And it's different for every building. So you're never gonna have the same thing necessarily twice. Yeah, that's something that I think we should have the meeting of the minds. So I don't want to go on record for any of that. What you should have is dialogue with your local community. You should have dialogue with Richard Conrad, who's the executive director for the State Historic Building Code, who may be able to help you. He's written code, he's written over the language, he knows the building, and I don't want to usurp the property or sound like a bureaucrat. But I recognize that it's the local decision that the people need to make. And so you need to invite the right people to the table involved in that decision to reach a conclusion for that, for the specific areas.
And a follow-up, can we go through a process so that it's not
What you might do is the local planning zoning, get something into the code. You may have a overlay zone I talked about, historic preservation overlay zone or something. So those are special design guidelines for just a specific area, and that can be defined by every building in that area has a special set of rules that it follows. And it still has to follow, as far as life safety code permits, but it has some special guidelines that may allow for some alternatives to what maybe you have to do as part of the code.
Great. Commissioner Wolf?
Along the same line, the more specifically, I mean, we've had some projects, and I'm an architect myself. I've faced some projects where the new provisions of the basically the fire code, that urban wildlands fire interface stuff that is quite restrictive on materials, makes it very difficult to do renovations, reconstructions, and replace or create new old materials in terms of how you put them together. For example, there's an applicant in town that has endeavored to do a project recreating one of the old train stations here in town, and you just can't have under the urban wildlands fire interface parts of the code, you can't have the exposed eaves and rafter tails and things like that unless they're made out of like bronze or something. So I mean, it's very difficult. So it's a very real problem for us.
And that might be something, the State Historic Building Code meets at the Preservation Conference in May in Santa Monica, but that's something that maybe, I don't know who we all would need to have a conversation, because obviously it's going on all over the area. And unfortunately, the bad thing is all jurisdictions are maybe, unless you're having a dialogue, are doing it by themselves. So again, why reinvent the wheel? Maybe there needs to be a forum or something that the codes people, the fire people demand so they won't really bend much. But it might be a discussion with the State Historic Safety Board that can help the local jurisdictions maybe a little bit and see, can we reach a compromise here? Can we talk with the fire marshal in Sacramento? Because fire people are, as we know, they're on their own people, but it doesn't mean we can't talk to them and try to find something.
Well, it's also in the state building code. So our code official is doing his job when he says, no, you can't do this. And you go through plan check and, you can't do this and this and this and this. And it sounds like, it puts us in an awkward position as a jurisdiction, and it puts our applicants and developers in a bad spot too, because they're not going to be able to swim upstream to say, oh yeah, I'd like to not have to have the whole California building code apply to my project. So we need some help from the state.
Well, and let me, the project that Commissioner Wolf was talking about is an infill project that is intended to be compatible with the Lower Main Street corridor.
Okay.
And, I'm sensitive to those kinds of issues. And, the problem that I think you will find up and down the Gold Country is that, small towns with small staffs are in a reactive mood, or mode rather, and we don't have the resources to stay up with what the State Fire Marshal Association or the other agencies are imposing on us, and so it creates a horrendously difficult thing for a small community to grasp with.
And maybe we could have further discussion, and I could present that at the safety board, because ideally there would be a set of guidelines, especially like you would have existing buildings, so if it's a rehabilitation versus new construction. And maybe the new construction recognizes that we can't exactly have what we had before. And sometimes you don't want to do that anyway because it was just bad design or something, or it was a detail that leaked or it never worked in the first place. And any downtown doesn't remain static. It evolves over time, and there's new construction, new design. And maybe that's just part of for new buildings has to be encompassed. So we can't have, maybe for a new building, exposed eaves because it's a new building. And even the State Historic Building Code won't allow that doesn't apply under the State Historic Building Code because it's a new building. But if you were doing, say, reconstruction, then we'd have the argument of, well, the State Historic Building Code says you can put it back, but the fire code says you can't. So now where's the meeting of the minds? And that's the problem that we have every single time. So I don't know if there's some way that, again, that can be a case study or something that, at least there's some precedent that people can, you're not up by yourself all the time making decisions.
Well, let's apply for a grant for a case study for our
There
community.
we go. Yeah, yeah. It's like, and of course, as you should know, the State Historic Building Code has no budget, so. It's, yeah. It's just money. It's just, yeah.
We don't have a budget either.
But you know, we every now and then, because we get the Tahoe region comes to our office sometimes for 106, Federal 106 review. And so the cabins, sometimes, there are different cabins in different areas, have the same problem. And it's either, sometimes it's reconstruction, sometimes they want to add addition, a lot of times they want to add addition. So it's whether it's compatible. But we've had the same, at least for the roofing, we've had the same problems. And what they've been doing is putting, it's, you know, do you allow a standing seam roof, metal roof now, as opposed to, because you can't do wood. And it used to be that you used to be able to do the vapor barrier or something, which added some protection to get the class rating up, so you can still do wood shingles. And then the famous, I think LA brought in the famous video of the fireproof shingles, the wood shingles, and they lit them on fire and they couldn't get them out. So it didn't really sell the product very well. But they used that as an example that even fireproof shingles aren't fireproof, because if you don't coat them every so many years, it wears off. So so that's what LA was arguing why we shouldn't allow them. But we did approve shingles for that case. So it's an interesting dialogue, and maybe we can talk further on with Richard. Okay.
Great. Okay. Thank you very much. We do
well.
appreciate you coming up and giving us this presentation. It's very appropriate for where we are right now.
Excellent.
And what we're trying to accomplish right now. So we do. Yes, I was going to go for that. It seems like there are some people who would like to have this.
Thank you very much for that. Very interesting. Do any of the commissioners have any questions or comments that they'd like to make, or any further discussion on this presentation?
Madam Chair, I actually have a number of comments, if I might then. First, the most striking thing for me is I must have missed that meeting because all my fellow commissioners were there, and clearly I wasn't, because I didn't ask any questions.
Yes.
So that was doubly informative for me, because I thought I had seen this presentation, but apparently I hadn't. I am becoming more acutely interested and aware of our historic needs in this community. And I'm not sure that the Planning Commission has all of the tools that we need. I want to thank staff for doing this. I'm going to consider it a primer. I wrote down 9 items I'm going to run through very, very quickly. They don't all have to be answered or commented on now in the sake of time, and staff can come back at some later point. So I'll just kind of go through these. I'm not entirely clear on the application of the standards. In other words, what's eligible or covered? Is it only the declared historic districts? Does something have to be identified specifically as a historic feature based on the inventory? So I'm not entirely clear on that. The second question, and these aren't any order of priority, they're just how they popped into my little dinosaur brain. And of course, who pays and how do we align incentives? And I can blend 2 questions. And what funding do we have? Frequently the term tax project was mentioned, which I believe means that the community perhaps voted a sales tax or something else to fund some of these things, but that's always been kind of a struggle. And then I'll jump down to number 7 on my list, and that is, are property owners notified, that they're in these historic districts, and the requirements, and I won't say restrictions, but the implications of being in those districts? And then do we need to do something else for folks to remind them and let them know and provide them information? And what are we as the city, what are we compelled to do? What requirements are on us? What are we restricted in? And so again, it's the application of standards and how we are to follow them. it's mentioned we have historic residential districts. I do not believe we yet have a historic commercial district. And so I'd like to know if that's ever been worked on. I think it has, but it hasn't gone anywhere. And if not, why not? And what are the merits and of course the demerits of looking at a commercial historic district? I mean, we say historic Main Street, yet I don't believe it's officially a historic district. There was some discussion of a preservation ordinance and or an overlay zone. Those may be two very different things, but it would seem at a minimum, the preservation ordinance would provide some, if not cover, but a pretty solid basis for Planning Commission to base its action on. And then lastly, let me see. Oh, I'm going to go back to one other item. What about, is it time to do a new inventory? I think the issue of inventory was mentioned. And should we be doing a new inventory? And then the 50-year mark was mentioned as a qualifying factor, I think. And then lastly, and I think the speaker kind of talked on it a little bit. And this is one of the, we had a project like this not long ago. And this actually, I'm going to bring this back when we get to the bylaws discussion, because this is one of the things that motivates me on that topic. And that is, how do we balance codes and environmental requirements, like being energy efficient, with these standards and guidelines for the historic preservation? So, and Andrew, I have all these written down if you didn't catch them, but I think these are some of the things I would like to see pursued. Again, I would consider this a primer. Commissioner Keeney, I believe, also has some interest in this. And Commissioner, I'm not speaking for you, but I think you do. And for me, I think this is a very, very important issue, and one that I would like to see significant energy devoted to. Madam Chair, thank you for the time.
Thank you very much for the thoughtful questions. Do any other commissioners have comments or questions related to the presentation? Okay. Seeing none right now, I'll follow up with Commissioner Friend that I found it really enlightening, and also would like some direction in how we accomplish a little more clarity in what our current situation is, since clearly in 2011 they had some of the similar questions that I think come up to us still today. Okay, do any members of the public have comment on the presentation that was just shown to this commission? Pierre, as we have a couple hands up.
Yes, we do. We have 846 wishes to speak.
Okay, 846, caller 846, go ahead and unmute yourself. A reminder that comments are limited to 3 minutes. 846, you there? Okay, let's go ahead and move on to 857. See if 846 comes around.
Good evening, Planning Commission. So that was a great review of something 10 years ago. And the whole thing about replacing the windows wholesale, you know, I tried to get you guys to not approve vinyl windows wholesale all the time. And I think he really brought home the point, you know, the look, everything, and materials is quite important, especially with the siding. Replacing wood with concrete siding. So I agree this is a great starting point to have a discussion on how we want the ordinances and the rules in our city to grow. Had some other points here. And so our historic inventory was really done in the mid-'80s, 1980s. And since then, a lot of other structures have gained historical prominence. The national standard is 50 years. I really want the city to change immediately the demolition permit ordinance. Anything that's outside of a declared historic district right now can be $100 demo permit over the counter at City Hall. I think we really need to have something that says anything over 50 years, 75, 100 years, whatever you decide, cannot be demoed without a special review of the Planning Commission. At least have a discussion on, is this proper to demolish this building, even though it's outside of a declared historic building. By age should be one of the protections. Anyway, I have a bunch of other notes, but I think this is a great starting point, and I congratulate you all for having the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your comments. Okay, next person, Pierre.
Jennifer Chapman.
Okay. I think she might be 846. So Jennifer, if you can unmute yourself. Okay. Seems like she's unable to for right now. Do you want to go ahead and move on to the next one? We'll come back around to her.
Let's go to Ruth Michelson.
Okay, Ruth, you can go ahead and unmute yourself.
Thank you. Wow. I thought that was fantastic. Really, really great presentation. I'm really excited about historic preservation of our buildings, and I just liked so much to learn about the 4 treatments and the 10 standards and all those examples. Thank you so much for having that presentation. Very, very informative. And I really liked everything that Commissioner Friend brought up, all of the issues that the questions that he asked. I have many of the same questions. And, you know, it's interesting to me that 10 years ago, they were looking to have the Historic Advisory Commission. And we know that in 2015 is when it was disbanded for a lack of interest. And every opportunity that I can, I try to bring up the idea that we bring that back. Because especially after seeing this presentation and seeing just how complex these issues are, and you know, just like when you go to see a doctor who's maybe a generalist, and then you have specialty doctors, you wouldn't expect a generalist doctor to be able to advise you on, you know, very specific medical issues. And that's sort of the analogy that I draw with the Planning Commission. Yes, I know that you do have the advice of staff who are quite talented and skilled and knowledgeable. But I still think if we could bring back the Historic Advisory Commission, and I'd like to know more about why it was it was disbanded, I guess, as like I've heard, due to lack of interest. But I think there certainly is a lot of interest right now. And I'd love to see people who have expertise in this area, besides staff, you know, citizens who have expertise to be able to be on that Historic Advisory Commission. And also as an owner of a building, an 1856 building, which is the building 352 Main, which used to be Rivendell Books, that has the interior exposed with the iron door and window and the brickwork, and we take a lot of pride in that. I would really like to see a historic district, and I would really like to see an updated inventory, everything that you talked about tonight. And I'd be very willing to volunteer efforts in that direction. So probably my 3 minutes is up. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ruth. Okay, next up, Pierre.
We have Kurt Kalin.
Okay.
Smith.
Kurt, can you go ahead and unmute yourself?
Yeah, I hope I'm unmuted. Good evening.
You are.
Commissioners. I guess I'd like to follow up with the questions posed by Commissioner Friend. They're good questions. The survey that you have was done in the 1980s. That's nearly 40 years old, and it wasn't meant to be complete. It was meant to be a first start. My source for that is Marilyn Ferguson, who is the curator at the Fountain Tolman Museum, and you can also call up Mary Corey, who'll tell you the same thing. So it needs to be updated. Secondly, you do have the inherent powers of the Historic Advisory Committee, as I understood it, it was merged. A third point is that Pierre and Andrew years ago put together a great program on the same subject, and the bottom line, and they'll correct me if I'm mistaken, was two things. One, those communities who establish historic standards, and two, have a commission that enforces it, like what this representative from the state described. Property values actually go up, and sales tax actually goes up. As far as whether you have jurisdiction over historic properties in commercial areas, I'm not sure how you define it, but certainly on Cedar Ravine, there's a number of office buildings and some businesses there. So it's desperately needed. It's been talked about for a long time, and you're in a position where you can make recommendations. Remember how you had a meeting on formula businesses, and there were only 2 persons who showed up? Part of the is it how you explain it to people. So when you explain formula businesses, who knows what that is? But if you said it's to make sure that should we have chain stores on Main Street? Should we preserve the architectural standards? Things that kind. You might find out more people coming up. I don't have a clock in front of me, but the last thing is you could always go to there's the El Dorado County Historical Society, and then there's the Heritage Association, both devoted to the topics that you're talking about, and ask them to make some, put them on notice to come on in and provide proposals, solicit proposals that provide answers to the kind of questions you've raised. But gosh, this subject's been kicked around for years now, and I hope you could go forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay. We'll try Jennifer 846 one more time.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Oh, great. I don't know what the problem is. I just wanted to say, I think I've mentioned it before, but I'll just say it again, that Friends of Historic Hangtown, kind of in conjunction with the draft EIR for the Clay Street Bridge project, did have a historic, an architectural historian do a reconnaissance survey. It's, it's very, very, we only had $2,500. So she's done a lot of work, in the Motherlode region in general. But anyway, the point is that she identified a lot of buildings. Essentially, when you guys talk about a survey, which, certainly the 1980s, a lot would show up on that wasn't going to show up at the time. And she did identify a lot of buildings. And then she also identified the buildings that have facades, which just mean that, there's kind of a historic core that has kind of a layer on top. But anyway, I guess the point is that I've sent in information about this survey, and she actually did a lot of the forms, the historic record forms that would get sent into Office of Historic Preservation. But the gist of it is that there's been some work done on a survey more recently in 2018, and I guess I'm just wondering if there's a way to how to bring it to the commission, just to share that information, just to even see, the 37 buildings that she identified plus the facade ones, and she identified them as contributing, having enough integrity as buildings to contribute to a historic district. And it's just that it's some recent work that was done by an architectural historian that, nobody's really taken a look at. I mean, I'm planning to try to just send, information to the building owners on Main Street, just for awareness, but it would be really wonderful if, I don't know that we can propose agenda items or we can, in any way provide you with, information like that. But if there's a way to do that, I guess I just want to say that this has been done. I think Pierre's seen it before, and, I guess I just feel like it's the beginning of a conversation, basically. I mean, we've got things like the Odd Fellows building, there's just so many, interesting pieces of this that we have on Main Street, and to just begin to kind of look at it as a whole is pretty exciting. Definitely 37 buildings, with a lot of integrity that, would be contributors, and some of them are actually on the National Register or eligible alone, like the post office, which of course, isn't on the register yet, but is, everybody seems to understand that it is a classic WPA building. Anyway, I just wanted to say we have some updated survey information that we haven't really had a venue to look at it as a community, and I guess I'm just offering to facilitate or be involved in sharing that however we could. Thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer. Okay. Any other public comment? It looks like
I don't see any new
all
speakers.
of the hands have raised have gone. Yeah. Okay. Staff, do you have any follow-up to any of the questions or comments that you heard? Is there a way that Jennifer may send the information that she has for distribution to the commission, or I'm not exactly sure how that would be managed if she wants to share it?
Madam Chair, and staff can correct me, but it certainly could be submitted to Planning Commission as a communication item, right? People can write into us all the time and they can send us stuff. It becomes part of the record, I think.
That is correct.
Perfect. Okay. So Jennifer, if you're still there and you'd like to send in your information as a communication to the Planning Commission, you are welcome to do so.
Great, thank you.
Okay, thanks.
Madam Chair, if I might, I just had one other comment based upon what I heard, and I guess it's just safe to say that character costs money, right? I mean, to preserve character, it's not free. And there are costs for people, property owners, if we're going to do enforcement and all that sort of thing. And so these are the incentives from my perspective we have to align and figure out how to do. It's one thing for the community to say, we really value this. And right now I'm separating private residential from commercial, but really I think commercial would almost be easier from my perspective if we had it in an inventory in a district. So in any event, none of it's free.
That is indeed factual.
Madam Chair, if I may, I wrote down, and I have 9 questions that Commissioner Friend had posed, and I'm sure probably Mr. Painter took down the questions as well. I'm happy to go through them, and maybe Mr. Painter and I can sort of tag team answers, because I think Mr. Andrew is probably much more thoroughly knowledgeable about some of these areas than I am. But happy to go through and attempt to answer some of these questions as the best of our abilities this evening, if that's the pleasure of the commission.
Absolutely. I didn't want to put you on the spot, but I'd love to hear some of your responses to what our current situations are with his questions.
So Andrew, if it's okay with you, what I'll do is I'll just read the question and maybe just give a brief response, and feel free to jump in or add additional detail as you see would be appropriate. So the first question posed was not clear on the standards, the inventory, and the districts. So I'm probably missing a little bit of detail to that first question. But basically we do have, as was mentioned earlier, we have 4 distinct residential historic districts that were created by council action. So they're codified. So they're actually a mapped boundary that's part of the zoning ordinance. We do have an historic district overlay zone. So in other words, that lays on top of the base zone district. So it could be R1, 6,000, which is a single family 6,000 square foot lot, or 10,000, 20,000, whatever it may be. There may be even some multifamily in there. But the overlay historic district then means that if we have any development activities or what we call substantive changes or modifications to an existing structure within a historic district, it is then subject to site plan review. And the site plan review, your commission goes through these applications all the time. Sometimes they have nothing to do with any historic district. We go through a site plan review application, say for new commercial. But if there's change, what we would call a major change to a building within one of these historic districts, then it comes before you, such as changing of siding or change to windows or that sort of thing. Or as there was a question regarding demolition. If there's a demolition of any structure, regardless of the age, within an historic district, that demolition has to be brought before the commission for approval. And then again, and probably with the last part of that question was standards. So I think as you saw in the presentation, and I think Andrew had brought out as well, we have the Secretary of Interior guidelines that must be followed. And again, those are guidelines. So in other words, they're not, you know, black and white, but they are to be followed to the greatest extent possible, unless of course you can find justification and findings not to follow them. One of the easier ones would be the historic building code. So a lot of times, as the presenter pointed out in that video, which was, I think, a good refresher for staff as well, at least it was for me, that allows us to sort of have additional flexibility with the application of the current 2019 California building codes, where we're trying to do what we can to preserve the historic integrity of a building. So with that, if I missed anything, or if Andrew wants to add some additional detail, which I'm sure he can do, I'll turn it over to him at this point on that question.
I guess I would add something to it. I don't believe Mr. Rivas mentioned that those structures that the city council that has deemed them historic, those also are subject to Secretary of Interior standards if modifications are being made to those structures. I believe Director Rivas mentioned those buildings, structures within historic districts, but it also is applied to those properties, those buildings, structures that have been deemed historic by city council as well.
If I could, Madam Chair, to staff, one of the challenges, at least if I recall, we had a building, I think, on Cedar Ravine that was demolished. I don't think it was within a historic district specifically, and arguments were made, and I think I approved the demolition because, as a commissioner, to deny the demolition, I couldn't make findings, right? So the challenge was I didn't want to approve it, but I was compelled to on the basis of a lack of findings to prohibit the property owner from doing what they want to do with the property. Now, I may have some of my facts mixed up, and please don't hurt me, but it's kind of along those lines to provide commission clear guidelines or foundation for us to make findings on which we can base our actions, because our actions have consequences for the property owners and for the community, for the city.
If I may, Madam Chair, just to follow up on what Mr. Friend was saying,
sorry, Pierre, really quickly, can you mute the two callers, because you can kind of hear them again?
Sure.
Thank you very much.
That particular building was located in an historic district. Therefore, it was subject to review and approval by the Planning Commission before it could be demolished. And so the city did end up seeking the advice of a historian to actually do a thorough review of the project. It was, of course, you recall, appealed to the city council. The city council, of course, considered the information, both the recommendation, the findings of the Planning Commission, and then the additional information that was supplied from the historian. And the Planning Commission, or the city council, also agreed that the building had been severely modified over time, did not have any significant person that actually lived in the building, and that it was permissible or justification for the city to go ahead and allow it to be demolished. And that's what happened on that building. Okay, so I will go ahead, unless there's any further discussion, and Mr. Friend's first question, I'll go ahead and move on to the second question. And that was, who pays? Do we have incentives such as any, city funding or outside funding, and then tax credits? So don't really have too much really to add there, other than when a property owner comes forward to do rehabilitation of their building, and they're subject to the Secretary of Interior standards because they have an historic building in an historic district, that cost is borne by the owner. The city itself does not have any funding available to assist with a property owner to rehab their building. In the past, the city did have a housing rehabilitation program that was funded through the Community Development Block Grant Program. We no longer have that program. I do understand that there are different programs to assist property owners to rehab their building, but staff currently is not aware of any available funding to do that. As far as tax credits, I know that there are tax credits that have been utilized by property owners in the past and on different projects to help defer the cost of investing in their property to maintain and preserve the historic integrity of the property and the buildings on that property. So maybe Mr. Painter can add more to those answers to the question.
Yeah, the staff is aware of some incentive programs. Most of them have to do with, well, the ones that relate to income related properties. I think the speaker during the workshop video mentioned it briefly when he talked about tax credits. Those particular types of programs are something that the city currently would not qualify for. Specifically related to, because we would have to create a district, as I understand it, to meet the federal standard. And also because those tax credits are related to income related generated properties, typically a single family residence, which makes up the majority of our historic districts, are single family residential or multifamily residential in general, I guess is what I should say, and not necessarily income commercial buildings. We're kind of limited in the availability of that credit to be used in our current makeup of our historic districts. There is some, I think, a relatively new program with California that I don't know too much about, other than there's also some requirements regarding the city being a certified, the term escapes me, certified community, where the State Office of Historic Preservation would be involved with making sure that our city meets their criteria, and that needs to be updated and kept up. And what that would mean is if a city or local government is deemed one of those, again, I'm sorry, I may be mistaken on how it's described, but what the state project or state rehabilitation incentive would allow does provide some limited monies, but it's based on a tax credit on your property tax. So it involves not only the county assessor, tax collector, but also the city, and the applicant, the property owner, would have to present a project that would meet the merits of the program, and then have a certain amount of time in which they would make those improvements over the course of the various phases, perhaps of their rehabilitation project. And during that time frame, there would be a tax credit, because the city local government would get the benefit of having a rehabbed building in the community, and yet the property owner would obtain a tax credit to assist with making those improvements. So it's a very general description of that. I may be mistaken on a couple of the main tenets there, but yes, there are, to answer your question, yes, there are some tax incentive programs out there, both at the state and federal level.
Thank you.
Okay, I'll move on to question number 3. Are the property owners notified? And Commissioner Friend, you can correct me. I'm understanding that to read, how does a property owner know they're in a historic district as opposed to being notified of an application, meaning the surrounding property owners?
Yes, Pierre, thank you so much. Yes, and I understand, and I could be mistaken. I understand that now in the title process, when somebody's purchasing property, they're informed. I could be wrong about that, and if I'm wrong, that's something I think we should correct. But all of the folks that live in a district now, how could we bring them up to speed to let them know, hey, you're in this district. If you ever wanted to do work to your home, your property, here are the standards that would apply, and you direct them to this. And that's really my question there. Thank you.
So to answer the first part of your question is yes, whenever there's a change in ownership, purchase of property, that is part of the disclosure statements, and it's clearly indicated in there whether or not the property is located within a local jurisdiction's historic district. So that's clearly a new property owner is notified upon purchase and reading through their disclosures that the property is located in a historic district. But as far as somebody that may have been owned the property for 10, 20, 40 years, do they know they're in a historic district? It's really hard to say about that. Typically, I think that's more of the responsibility of the property owner to be sort of aware of what their property is zoned. They may not know that they're zoned single-family residential 6,000 square foot lot. Maybe they don't, those are a lot of kinds of questions that, and I think staff will be open to reasonable means to notify property owners of whether or not they're in a historic district that's within a reasonable cost to do so.
But those districts change, right? I mean, those districts haven't been from in perpetuity. They were created at some point. And so, for example, when we created the districts, was notice given when the districts are created? And districts change, right?
Yeah, those districts, I don't think they've changed since they were first formed. And I'm making the assumption that the property owners within those districts were notified and appropriate public hearings were held before the Planning Commission and the City Council before they adopted the ordinance creating those historic districts.
Thank you.
Okay, I'll move on to the fourth question. Well, the fourth question is, what is the city compelled to do? I guess I'll start by saying, for the most part, the city is compelling itself to regulate the preservation of historic structures within the city of Placerville. And it did so by creating these 4 historic residential districts. And it did so by adopting the ordinance, adopting the development guide that has the design standards that your commission is to follow. That was enacted sometime by the City Council, and the City Council, of course, would also follow its own general plan, goals, objectives, guidelines, the zoning ordinance, the development guide. They're all adopted, and that is the city that went through the process of creating all of those different layers of regulations and standards and such because the city of Placerville feels that it is important. In other words, the citizens, I'm assuming, agreed. They participated in all of the hearings and the public process that went through to get to this point. But I guess, Andrew, if you have any more to add to that, I think it's more or less the city. The only other non-city compelling would be through the California Environmental Quality Act, of course, whenever the city takes action to modify structures or land or review development applications. It's subject to the California Environmental Quality Act, which also looks at historic preservation as well, impacts on historic resources.
Pierre, if I could just qualify that question just a little bit, so, or ask it a different way. Are we compelled to apply the standards and guidelines? Department of Interior, are we compelled to do that? We're obligated?
Well, if you read those, they are guidelines, and so there is some flexibility, but the Planning Commission is compelled, because it is the duty of the Planning Commission to implement the city's adopted goals, objectives, and policies with the general plan, to uphold the zoning ordinance, and to apply as appropriate the design guidelines in accordance with the ordinance and the adopted design guidelines. So that is correct. I mean, there's 5 commissioners, and your job is to ensure then as staff comes forward with its recommendation that the city is moving forward with approving development applications that meet the intent of the established ordinances and standards.
I will add to that as well. Under City Code 10410, which is the historic buildings in the city regulations, where the Secretary of Interior standards are codified as the design criteria. That section of code also goes further to state that when the Planning Commission or City Council on Appeal, when they're reviewing a development project that involves exterior alterations of a building structure within a historic district, that I will quote, it says, let's see. The exterior alteration shall conform to the historic criteria. And that historic criteria is the Secretary of Interior standards. So that, in my mind, would compel the commission to follow.
Yep.
Okay, moving on to question 5 on my list is residential districts. Do we have a commercial historic district? So we currently do not. Some of the commissioners may recall that when we did have an historic advisory committee, they did go through an exhaustive process to define a potential downtown commercial historic district. There was a workshop that was held between the Historic Advisory Committee and the Planning Commission that reviewed that whole process. And so, and Andrew can jump in, basically my understanding is where we are in that process is we need to take then that approved or that recommended downtown historic district boundary to the Planning Commission, so that the Planning Commission can then make its formal recommendation, and staff will take that to the City Council. Okay, number 6, and I think we sort of answered question number 6 with one of the earlier questions, the first one.
That was the preservation ordinance. Preservation ordinance is number 6.
Yeah, preservation ordinance and overlay zone. And I think we went over that. We do have an ordinance, as Andrew pointed out earlier. It's in the zoning code, and it's implemented through our site plan review process. And of course, the overlay zone, there's a zoning, it's a mapping overlay. It's a historic district that maps out the 4 residential historic districts in our zoning map. Okay, moving on to number 7. There was a question, you were questioning, is there a time to do a new inventory? And I know Mr. Painter will have a lot more to answer to that one because we've talked about this over the last, I don't know how many years. I would just add that that would be something that we would want to have the city council to provide for the funding and the direction of the staff to pursue that. That would be probably quite a significant cost effort, probably well over $100,000, maybe more, to update that inventory or to conduct a new inventory, as I think somebody brought out, as far as over the last couple decades, probably a lot of buildings have crossed that 50-year-old threshold. I mean, I know I have. So I think that's a good comment, and it's something that staff has talked about quite a bit. But again, I think that's a significant effort in terms of cost and also funding that would need to be made available in order to secure the historians to actually conduct those inventories. And maybe Mr. Painter has more to add to that one.
No, I think you've summarized it quite well. It would be an extensive effort, and something that Director Rivas and I really don't have that expertise. So it would further need people of that background to assist in that effort.
Okay, moving on to question number 8. And that was in regards to what's the defining factor on what's historic. Is it the 50-year mark? Is the age of a building? And that is very standard. In fact, I remember I was in one of these antique stores some time ago asking about, and I asked one of the people in there, I go, well, how old does something have to be? How old does it have to be an antique? And that was the answer from this gentleman. He told me if it's 50 years old, it's an antique. So, and I've seen that in other ordinances that it's the 50-year mark when a building turns 50, it becomes more of an historic building. But maybe that is something, I know our own code doesn't strictly define it by age. It's usually based on an inventory that was performed, an evaluation performed on the structure, as opposed to just a hard and fast time. But 50 is usually that time. And so usually we would look at that then when we're conducting our environmental analysis under CEQA. I think under CEQA, I think I remember seeing in one of the guidelines on impacts to historic resources, it's just that 50-year mark. Moving on then to question number 9. That was a question of balance between our codes, environmental requirements with historic preservation. And so I think that may have been sort of answered piecemeal through some of these other discussions we've had on the previous questions, but we are where we are in terms of how the city views its historic resources, and from the general plan down to our development guide and going through the site plan review process is, from staff's perspective, it is a priority of the city to preserve its historic integrity. It's important to the residents, it's important to the city. And so we have our construct, if you will, of ordinances and procedures to ensure that over time, as development occurs, that we're preserving that historic integrity and the cultural fabric that we have here in Placerville.
Thank you very much for that. Very interesting and a lot of food for thought today that I'm sure we'll be circling back around to. Any other comments or questions or anything from commissioners?
Madam Chair, I would just like to thank you and my fellow commissioners for enduring that, and for staff for doing a good job at catching and answering. Thank you.
Thank you. Commissioner Keeney, do you have a comment?
I did, and mostly I want to thank everyone for sticking through this. It was a long presentation, but we've gotten some very important questions answered. Thank you, Pierre and Andrew, really for addressing all of those. I think Commissioner Friend hit on some concerns of mine. So thanks a lot for that. I just also want to express my appreciation for the information that the city gives us commissioners. You provide us a copy of the Secretary of the Interior standards for our review. Our development guide is just an excellent resource. When we get these cases that come before us, I read the staff report, I go back through the ordinances, and but the development guide really does help us walk through and understand these issues. And so I really appreciate the hard work that went into developing that. And thank you for making that available to us. I think one of the problems that we have is in the presentation that we just watched, he gave us some incredible case examples, and that's just not what we get. You know, we don't get the example of where they want to put another story on an existing building, and does the treatment match what was there historically? And that's those are really I don't know, you can learn a lot from those. We have much more subtle changes. We have difficult questions to ask, including the demolition on Cedar Ravine and that historic district. And that's why we have to it's our responsibility as commissioners to make findings to justify our decision when we have to go against what's written in our ordinances. And it's obvious that the city did an incredible amount of work when they created the historic districts, when they developed those ordinances. And so, it's just incumbent on us to read that, take another look at it, research it, and do the best we can to preserve what we can and make a good justification for those instances when we have to go against these guidelines. And we've also been given some great examples of how, I won't say it's easy, but how it can be done to help us help preserve what we have in our historic districts. So just really want to sum it up by saying thank you again. Great work, and I really appreciate it. I think the last case that came before us was just a terrific example of why it's so important to apply these standards to the buildings, the houses, mostly in our historic districts. It is very important to keep that integrity.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I agree that it was interesting when he went through the 4 different phases of how to approach the way the preservation, rehabilitation, restoration, and reconstruction. I thought that was really helpful to hear how those kind of tie together and how you kind of prioritize and reprioritize them based on all of the different factors, obviously, that he went over. So yes, I agree. That was really helpful, very enlightening, and I look forward to seeing where that goes. Anything else, Commissioner List, Commissioner Hochberg? Nope. Okay. Okay, great. So we will go ahead and move on to our new business for the evening, which is touching on our bylaws, specifically discussing bylaw Article 9N, which covers the part of our agenda that is matters from commissioners and staff. Mr. Painter, Mr. Rivas, you guys touching on this one?
Well, I don't have much to add other than what I provided for you. I believe it was our take on your direction to us was to either provide clarifying language regarding that order of business item, or provide what the intent of that business item. And from staff's perspective, I provided the intent as evidenced by what I've seen since I've been with the city for 20 years. So typically it's not an item where new business is brought forward and a discussion is brought forward. It's just really announcements and to answer simple questions regarding development within the city. But Director Rivas, do you have anything to add to that?
Thank you. Yeah, I'll just make a couple of additional comments on that. I think where staff started to see an issue was becoming almost a second open forum, except that at open forum, that's basically the ability of the citizens to directly address, you, the commission, and the same with the city council. But since the item is not on the agenda, there's no discussion about that item. And so staff started seeing then this matters from commission of staff sort of morphing into a second tier open forum where maybe the commission would start getting into a discussion of something that's not on the agenda, and then commissioners were discussing it, and therefore then it would seemingly open the requirement to have the public then weigh in on that discussion. Well, that's the real problem, is because then that's a violation of the Brown Act. It's not to say that if the commission has a consensus to direct staff to place something on a future agenda as a discussion item, staff is very, is happy to do that. But that would be the appropriate way to do it, because then the agenda is notifying the public that a particular topic is going to be discussed. So they may or may not decide, oh, I want to participate in that, other than just the participation by the public members that just happen to be at the meeting at any given planning commission meeting. So as Mr. Friend pointed out, matters from the commissioners and staff, it just allows staff maybe the ability to update the commission on the status of, say, an application you approved that may have been appealed. We can tell you what the status is, or what decision was made by the city council, or if there's some city event or certain things that staff feels would be a benefit for the commission to know, we could just announce it. And then vice versa, maybe a commissioner had attended a conference or a meeting or knows of some city function or something and just wants to then daylight that and announce it. That's what this is for. But we were just getting concerned that this was becoming more of a means of placing an item that's not on the agenda, and then that particular item being discussed.
So, Madam Chair, if I could speak to this, and for the most part, I'm in concurrence precisely with what staff is saying. I have observed in city council meetings, for example, that there'll be open comment. And then at the conclusion of open comment, that's actually when the mayor seems to do it, he'll speak to a couple of the items that are on there, and then possibly provide direction for where they want to go in the future. To the extent that any item that's brought up under this topic is not agendized, there can be no opportunity for a public forum for the public to speak to them, because they're not on the agenda to begin with. But there's no other place on our agenda for us as commissioners to raise a question or an issue on something that may have been brought up previously in open forum, or maybe a question that came up under an item that we previously considered. And specifically, I can give you the example. A couple of meetings ago, we had, there was an issue with a home in the historic district, and then the only reason we didn't have to act on it was because the applicant withdrew their application. I think you probably remember this particular scenario. So, but he raised a question. It's one of the ones I brought forth on the previous presentation. That's why to me they're kind of linked. And that he mentioned something about energy efficiency requirements versus preserving the historic character. And I actually wanted to pursue that for a future item. And it seemed to me that under item 9N is where I, as a commissioner, would raise that to staff and say, hey, this came up under a previous item. I'd like staff to look into it. And so that's kind of where I'm at with this. And so I appreciate the language that staff has offered. And I'm going to go ahead and make a motion, at least just for the sake of discussion, as to what Article 9N, how it should read. And the first part of it's going to be exactly the language of staff that's in the Planning Commission staff report. And so Article 9N would be, this is the opportunity for staff to update those in attendance of the status of upcoming meetings, semicolon, of recent actions taken by City Council on items previously considered by the Commission, semicolon, of the status or completion of city and community projects, semicolon, of community-wide activities and events, parentheses, e.g. Brewfest, National Night Out, Wagon Train, etc., close parentheses. For commission members, and so we have the staff report language there. Then I would add, in addition, this is an opportunity, now I have to read, pardon me, I have to read from, this is an opportunity for commissioners to speak on issues for future consideration, which may have arisen during public comment and or during an item heard by the commission. So that's my intent. And I think it gives us a little bit more, flexibility to do that without getting into, as Pierre said, all of a sudden now we're back debating it, because we should not be debating it, but we should simply be raised. If we have something we want to raise, hey, I'd like to see this come back. This raised a question in my mind, etc. That's my perspective on this. That's my motion.
Okay. Would you be open to adding at the very end of that something just kind of reminding people that discussion should remain limited and the items should just be briefly discussed and then move towards an agendization or not?
If I can get a second, we can.
Oh yeah, sorry about that. Based on the language that Commissioner Friend just related, does anyone have a second to adding that as the language?
I'll second for the purpose of discussion.
Okay, so seconded by Commissioner Gottberg. I think I like the language that you added, just that it's a time to bring up, because I do agree it's limited and where you can bring up that kind of stuff. But I think a reminder that discussion shouldn't occur and that the topic should then be agendized would be an important just clarification, I guess.
Sorry.
I have a comment on that. I would not want our concerns to overburden staff. They have a set time and budget. They are under the direction of the City Council. And so I think I want to see some language in there that limits what kinds of requests. If it's a simple update, that I'm perfectly fine with that. However, in the past, commissioners have made a request of staff that actually might entail, some exhaustive research, and that's not within our purview. That is something that, while it may be a very good point, City Council needs to direct staff to do that. So if it really is a concern of the city, then it needs to they need to dedicate funding and time. And so I don't want the Planning Commission to feel like commissioners to feel like they have the ability to ask staff to do extensive research to answer a question.
Madam Chair, my experience has been that when staff sees a train like that coming, they're usually pretty good at letting us know why it might be problematic. Number one. Number two, in all my time on commission, I really haven't seen that as a problem, but there really is no other opportunity for us to raise a question or comment on something that we would like to see agendized. There's no other way to do that. And this is the one opportunity I think that we have.
Madam Chair, if I can just make a comment from staff, and this is just to help maybe get some clarification from Commissioner Friend. when the commission is considering a project, and then there's a motion, and then a second, then a discussion. During that time, I think it's very advantageous for a commissioner with concerns or questions to really flesh it out at that time. You can flesh it out amongst yourselves as you deliberate in the project, and certainly ask staff. And then even after the role is taken and the project is either approved or denied, the commission can certainly make some comments or have a discussion immediately after action was taken on that project, rather than postponing it to matters from commissioners and staff. So I'm assuming what you mean is not something that was just previously considered by the commission earlier in your agenda, but maybe some, let's just say you've seen a series of different actions that are then making you think of maybe the city needs to look at something differently, and you want to have a discussion of that, or maybe a code change because of how we've been viewing certain types of applications, something like that. And I'd like to hear from what our city planner, Mr. Painter, has to say, but I could see that section matters from the commissioners and staff. That would be an opportunity for adding future agenda items where then we would get a consensus. It wouldn't be an individual commissioner adding it, but it would have to be at least a consensus of 3 or more commissioners. Then staff can then agendize it on a future planning commission agenda for discussion.
Okay.
Let me, if I could just speak to that briefly. Here, certainly, that doesn't address if a member of the public comes to us during open forum and raises something that's not on the agenda, because we wouldn't be discussing it, right? So this is the opportunity for us to say, this was brought up. I'd like to have staff's opinion on it, and/or should we take this up at a future meeting? I mean, otherwise it's just dead. And we don't often deal with specifically with items that are brought up, but sometimes there are items that need to be brought up. And again, I remind that City Council does it this way, right? So the mayor does. I have seen the mayor do that. So that's one. Second, in deference to my poor little dinosaur brain, I may not always be quick on the draw to that question. May not formulate. It may formulate later during something else, and I'd still like the opportunity just to bring it up. And I don't see this necessarily as being onerous, number one, and number two, certainly if it weren't to work out, we could always change the bylaws.
Yeah, Madam Chair, if I can address then some of the comments the commissioner made. Yeah, you're absolutely correct, and I think the council handles it that way, and that's with respect to if a member of the public is asking a simple question, staff isn't going to answer it, but if the commission it wishes for us to answer it, we can certainly do that. That's not a Brown Act violation. I think the Brown Act violation is when you are discussing in depth some planning matter or some issue, not just a simple question. I think the council regularly will, they'll ask staff to answer a simple question, and staff certainly can do that.
And I agree with that, and I absolutely agree that this is not opening the door for any kind of protracted discussion on the part of the commissioner, particularly at the end of the meeting, and he'd get shot for doing that. So,
if I may, I was under the assumption, and for the years I've been on here, that item N was a communication time between staff and commissioners. And I think that what was brought up last time, if I'm not mistaken, or what brought it to mind, was that we had someone from the public that wanted to make a comment during that period. And everything I have heard to this point has not addressed that part of it. I would not want to limit with a list of items what we can say and what we can't say to staff or to other commissioners during this time. That's my problem with what Mr. Friend has brought forward. It seemed to me it was an exhaustive list, yes, but limiting in its scope of the things that we could say or couldn't say. So my question then is, are we looking at this as a means of communication? And if it is, I think we need to keep the wording very simple, that it is strictly a communication time between staff and commissioners. I'll leave it at that.
Okay.
So to my fellow commissioner, by no means am I proposing any sort of restriction of communication between commissioners and staff by any stretch. To the first point, since there's no agendized item, there's no right, the public can only speak and we open the public comment period. So, or they can speak to items that are agendized on the agenda, but there's no specific items agendized. So at least in my view, there's nothing for the public to speak on. And you're right, that was one of the problems. Man, I didn't think that individual had the right from the Roberts rules to speak to it. And I still agree that they don't have the right to speak under this section. I think it's I treat this as just a simple mention by a commissioner. This thought occurred to me. I'd like staff to provide either an answer or perhaps bring it back for detailed discussion later if it warrants detailed discussion. But if it's a simple question or something that came up, I think, as Pierre said, staff can answer it, and that's really all I'm saying. The way the language was, the intent language that staff provided, it says strictly for updating other members of committee work or updating members on topics, workshops, and seminars. That's all staff gave us, and to me, I think that was fairly limiting. Not that I disagree with that, but I think that language is limiting. And so I just want to broaden it. Again, if you just think of the scenario, somebody mentions something in public comment, during which time we cannot speak to it at all. We have to just let public comment do public comment. But then if somebody raises something that is of interest, or I have a question, this would be the time that I get to ask that question.
So I think we're kind of, oh yes, Commissioner Keeney. Mm-hmm.
I wonder if that concern is covered by the final phrase in the proposed language, which says general comments regarding planning and land use within Placerville. Does that, is that not broad enough for the issues that you anticipate, Michael?
I didn't know that it did, and I doubt that the chair would call me out on a point of order if I said, this came up earlier, blah, blah, blah. And they would say, well, that's not a comment regarding planning and land use within Placerville. So I don't know, but again, if this is intent language for future commissioners, just so they would know, this is what this is for.
Yeah, and I kind of agree with Commissioner Keeney that last part is sort of has the generalness in there, and I think maybe what I'm hearing is the staff would really like to ensure that future commissioners limit that discussion under that general comments, that it doesn't become a in-depth discussion. Would we just prefer to kind of clarify that line by saying like comments should, or discussion should remain topical and remain, and I guess. All right.
I'll make a friendly amendment to my motion because I know the hour is late. And I'm thinking about, I'm trying to do this on the fly. Comments regarding planning and land use within Placerville or other items which may be within the purview of the Planning Commission. So, because we shouldn't be really dealing with stuff that's not within our purview, right?
Agreed. Yeah,
so,
that's the dangerous area too. Mm-hmm.
You know, that echoes the language. I'm sorry, Nicole, I didn't mean to interrupt. I just, let me say that that echoes a language we have elsewhere in our agenda and our bylaws. Go ahead.
Oh, I just wanted a clarifying question on that. So is that amendment then to keep the language as is in the intent here with just that one addition to the end of the sentence at the very end, or other items?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you for the question as the seconder of the motion.
Yes.
So basically, I'm taking the language that staff provided in the report and then simply adding that little bit at the end.
Okay. Yeah, I'll accept that amendment.
And can you just say that language for me one more time, please, Commissioner? If you wrote it down.
Land use within Placerville or other items which may be within the purview of the commission.
Yeah, I mean, I think my concerns are similar in terms of asking staff a lot of things, but I think that change is appropriate.
Okay. So we have a motion and a second. Does anyone else have any further discussion on this topic?
There actually are people attendees with their hands raised. So technically we should be offering them a chance to speak.
Okay, great. That might be from earlier topic, but I don't mind doing so if that is appropriate. And
yeah, before we take a vote.
Got it. Okay, so I will go ahead and open public comment on this topic, and I have some hands raised. So Pierre, if you can.
Sure. We have number 846 requesting to speak.
Okay, 846. You may unmute yourself if you have comments on this topic.
Hi there, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Hello?
Yes, we can hear you. Are you there?
Hello?
We can hear you, Jennifer. Can you hear me?
Oh, I'm so sorry. Sorry about that. So I appreciate this whole discussion, and I guess one of my questions, you're kind of on this whole idea of how the planning commissioners themselves can, I guess, raise topics, and I guess what it's leaving me with is how the agenda gets set. You know, like tonight, for instance, was an educational piece. I mean, I understand that a lot of the agenda gets set by applications that you need to respond to. But I guess I would be asking the question if the commissioners themselves can propose an agenda item or request an agenda item or set the agenda, if the commission actually has that role or not. And it seems like they should be able to. So that would be, I guess, the primary comment there on this bylaws topic. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. So it looks like we have two other commenters on this topic. Do we want to go to 857, Pierre?
Yes, 857.
Thank you. 857, caller, you can unmute yourself.
Good evening, Planning Commission.
Hello.
Hey, so tonight, right now, the entire bylaws are up for changes, not just this one section, just so you know. This is a yearly thing, and at any point during the year, you can request to amend bylaws. And you might consider that you, instead of having a 5-5 attendance and vote, making it a 4-5. I don't know, something to consider. Because we've had a lot of problems getting 5 people to attend and vote on bylaw amendments. Anyway, so the Planning Commission has been empowered to facilitate zoning and planning issues by the City Council. You should not be scared of actually running your own show. If they need to make budget amendments, they need to do that. But you are empowered as a commission, not a committee. And there's a difference. The Brown Act allows for answers to public questions. You don't have to get into a broad discussion, but good governance says you really should answer basic questions by the public. Otherwise, it looks like you're ignoring them, and that's the wrong path to go down. I really think Agenda 9N discussion right now should be reports from commissioners and staff and requests for future agenda items by commission and staff and the public. You really need an item line in there to request future agenda items, just like the city council does. You're kind of reflection of their system. You need to have the same line item request for future agenda. Because I don't know who sets the agenda right now. Is it staff only? Is it the commission chair? But there needs to be a place in there, at least for the public, to request future agenda items outside of open public comment. So there's a couple of ideas for you to throw around there, and hopefully you get it right. Thank you.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Looks like we have one more, Kirk Smith here.
Let's see. Yes, Kirk Smith.
Okay, Kirk, you can go ahead and unmute yourself.
Sorry, I didn't know that I pressed the button.
We can hear you now.
So I'll pass. Thank
Oh,
you. It was a mistake. I didn't know the button was pressed. Thank you.
No problem. Got it. Okay, so seeing no other public comment, public comment on this topic, I will go ahead and close public comment and bring it back to the commissioners for final discussion and action. Yes, Commissioner Keeney.
I would prefer that the language be in, I apologize, I'm not an English major, although English is my first language. I'd rather use the active voice and have the words would be stricken, changed to is. That's in the first line. And if you're looking at the text 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, the word intended, I'd like to have that struck as well. And the reason I ask that is it makes it, as I said, what I think is called the active voice, and it is in more in keeping with the rest of the language in our bylaws. If you want to flip over to Article 9, under the consent calendar, there's a brief explanation under 9H, interest of the items of interest to the public. Again, it's just very direct language. And I think it just is more in keeping, like I said, it doesn't change the voice of the bylaws. It makes it, I said, makes it that active. The intent of the bylaw is for staff, and it, this time is for updating other members of the subcommittee, of subcommittee work and the other things. So that is a change that I would like to request. Otherwise, I think, staff has given us good direction, and with our other minor change about items under our purview, I think it's well written.
Commissioner Christine, give me the second item that you said, it's line number 1. I got that one, but I didn't get the second one.
See, it's line number 5, the word intended. I would rather it read, for commission members, this time is for updating other members of subcommittee work and so on.
Yeah, I think when Andrew wrote this, he was explaining intent as opposed to providing specific language. So that makes sense.
I agree.
Yeah.
Otherwise, I think it's just what we need. It's very, it's clear what this section is for.
Okay. So just to reiterate so that I know what we're at, then we would say the intent of this bylaw is for staff to update those in attendance, all of the different things. For commission members, this time is for updating other members of subcommittee work when applicable. the rest of that. And then when we get to and general comments regarding planning and land use or other items which may be in the purview of the commission within Placerville. What do we all think of that?
Do we need another motion for that? We had a motion and a second.
I'm not sure. I guess I would just ask that Commissioner Friend verify that what I just read.
If your intent is to go to the language that I offered previously, then I can work with staff on that. If your intent is not to do that, then respectfully, I would say I preferred the language that I offered previously.
Of adding in addition.
Which would have read planning and land use within Placerville or other items which may be within the purview of the Planning Commission.
Okay, so the intent of this bylaw is for staff to update those in attendance on the status of upcoming meetings, of recent actions taken by the city, yada yada. For commission members, this time is for updating other members of the subcommittee work when applicable, yada yada, and general comments regarding planning and land use within Placerville or other items which may be within the purview of the commission. Would you be happy with that as the paragraph?
Yes, Madam Chair, that was my intent.
Perfect. I think I just rearranged those. So if you will accept that as our final, as your motion for the language, and if Vice Chair Gottberg accepts that for her second.
Yeah, I'll second the change.
Okay. Any questions on how I just read that, and staff, does that make sense? What the final outcome is there?
Yep.
Okay. Any other questions or discussion from commissioners? Okay. And maybe we can just have a printout of this page when we have our next meeting so that we can all take a look at how the final language comes across.
Put on the consent calendar.
Perfect. Okay, so we have a motion, a second, and I don't see any further requests for discussion. So now we may call for a roll.
Member Friend.
Aye.
Vice Chair Gottberg.
Aye.
Member Keeney.
Aye.
Chair Lepper.
Aye.
Member List.
Aye.
Okay. So the updated to Article 9N in our Planning Commission bylaws has passed 5-0, and we will be provided with a version of it that we can just verify at our next meeting. Okay.
And Madam Chair, a
Yes.
question for staff. When does this take effect?
Upon this minute order.
Solid. So, because I have a question.
You've made a change to
I
the
have a
bylaw.
question on the next agenda item.
Okay, so that one is all done. New business is taken care of. So very appropriate. Let's move on to matters from commissioners and staff. Obviously, we just discussed changing this, but this item involves Commissioner and Development Staff to Services Department comments and reports on items not on the agenda. I had just written a reminder that you should be topical and discussion remain limited. Now we have even more clarity on that. So are there any matters from staff to the commissioners?
Steph has a couple of updates for you.
Okay.
One was mentioned earlier by a member of the public. Yes, the city has received an appeal of the action taken by the Planning Commission on, I believe it was the April 6th meeting, regarding the the Planning Commission's resolution 2021-02, and that's related to the Commission's authority that placed short-term rental use as a use that can be applied for in the highway commercial zone under a special temporary use permit. To both Pierre and I do not know the date in which that will be heard. That has not been set yet. The second appeal that's been filed relates to the Geartooth Ale Works project. And again, both of these appeals were submitted last week, and neither of these items are yet scheduled, but when we know more information, we will pass that on.
Okay, thank you very much. Pierre, do you have anything for us?
I don't. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Okay, wonderful. Commissioners, do you have any questions or comments to staff? Yes,
I do.
Friend.
Pierre or Andrew, when it's convenient, in follow-up to a question that was raised, maybe you could speak to us, and again, doesn't have to be tonight, on how the process for commissioners adding an item to the agenda.
Well, the quick response from staff would be looking at your bylaws, and let me find the right item, the right article.
It is in there, I think.
Yeah.
Is there any threshold for when it has to be voted on? Because I think I kind of heard either Pierre or somebody say, well, maybe you'd have to have, a vote on whether or not to do that. And I could see if a commissioner wanted something to be brought up and the other commissioner said, no, we're not interested in that. The chair, I think the prerogative of the chair is to say, well, I'd like to see a motion on this. But you wouldn't be able to do it then because it would be coming up under 9N, where no actionable items could occur. The chair, I think, would have to exercise prerogative and say, I request staff bring this back to next meeting. It's probably what would have to happen. Amy, you're very powerful in that chair, so use it.
Oh, yeah. So I think, with regards to that, I think we can just see how the outline of this new language affects how we discuss things, and when we have a topic come up that needs to or wants to be agendized, sort of navigate how the best way to do so is and see what the outcome of that is and how it should be recorded. That makes sense?
It works for me.
Okay.
Looks like it's Article 11A.
Would you mind reading it?
A matter placed on the commission's agenda by making the request to the executive secretary no later than 21 days preceding the meeting.
It doesn't require approval from other commissioners or anything?
It does not.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't know the nexus of that. It might be as old as the I think we have a copy of the 1964 bylaws. It may be a relic from that date. So
I would think it should follow however council does business. In my view, I would like to see us, and this is my personal opinion, and again, point of order if I'm out of order. I would think in terms of intent, I would like to see us conducting our business in a manner as close and as similar to how council conducts theirs. That's just my personal preference.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, well, I suppose one thing that, if I can interject, Chair Lepper, now that we've closed item 4, I suppose you could reopen that item. You certainly have the authority to do that. You could add a new article subsection, if you wish to address that issue and not cloud up the matters of commissions and staff. Make it a separate order of business item.
Okay.
Madam Chair, I'd like to see you take that under consideration and ponder it for a while before and bring it back next meeting.
I'm with you there, but I do think that maybe that might be a really good answer to how commissioners can bring up topics but keep the discussion very limited, and clarify that in that article. So, okay. Well, we can contemplate that one for now. We'll think about the language we have, reflect on it, and see if any of us come up with a little more clarity with clear, fresh brains and all of that for the next time. So are you guys all comfortable?
Do we have a next meeting?
Mr. Painter, will we have a meeting?
Do we have another meeting?
We always have regular meetings.
Yeah.
Is my answer. Yeah, it appears that we will have a meeting. The first meeting in May will occur.
Mm-hmm.
Day is that May?
But you will be notified if that were to change.
That's Cinco Eve.
Yeah, and I do think it's important that we have, like this meeting, for example, I was talking with Andrew, and let's watch the video in a meeting where we don't have anything going on, where we can all really focus on it and ingest and digest it and everything like that. So I do feel that there is plenty of discussion an ability to approach staff with things that you think would be helpful or move forward for the commission. So I think that that opportunity does exist and is pretty straightforward. So we can just contemplate if we want to add that as a specific outline in our bylaws. Does that sound good? Okay, so if anyone, does anyone else have anything further? Otherwise,
This was one of my favorite meetings.
it was very
It
interesting.
really was. Really
I
was good.
enjoyed doing learning rather than just all the,
Yeah.
public hearings and voting and everything. Yeah, it's nice to have time to focus on that.
Lots of work.
Okay, well, if there are no further matters, then I hope you all have a wonderful evening, and I will call adjournment of the April 20th Planning Commission meeting of Placerville at 8:57 p.m.
Oh yeah, it is that late.
Thank
Wow.
you.
Yes.
Thank you, everyone.
All right.
Night.
Have a great week, and looks like we'll see you in early May.
Yep.
Okay, have a good one.